Where is Naomi? Where is my wife?
Pregnancy hormones, darling. I am sure she will turn up.
I have always known you never liked her. Pray your hands are clean.
That room, that morning, that rage you just witnessed. It was not the beginning of this story. It was the breaking point of a man who had just lost the only person who mattered to him. Without explanation, without a trace, no answers, no body, no goodbye, just silence. And the worst part? He didn't even know what he was supposed to be angry at, because there was nothing to fight, nothing to chase, nothing to understand. Only a missing pregnant wife. And a fear growing in him that something had gone wrong in a way he could not see. But to understand why that moment happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Imagine waking up one morning and the person you love most in the world is simply gone. No note, no goodbye, no explanation, no sign of struggle, no trace of how or when or where, just gone. Like she stepped out of her own life and the door closed behind her. Now imagine that the last time anyone saw her, she was 2 months pregnant. That is what Marcus Whitfield woke up to. And what you just watched. That rage, that desperation. That man standing in the middle of his own home demanding answers from people who couldn't give him any. That was not the worst moment of his story. That was only the beginning of it. Because after that morning, Marcus Whitfield searched. He searched the way only a man who cannot accept losing her searches. Investigators, rewards, phone records, security footage. Every lead followed until it ran out. Every door knocked on until it stayed closed. He barely slept. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Because stopping meant accepting something he had already decided he would never accept. But the weeks passed anyway. And then the months. And the people around him began to do what people do when time passes and there are no answers. They started to whisper, quietly at first, then louder, that maybe she had left on her own, that maybe the marriage was not what it seemed, that maybe a woman who had come from nothing, a woman with no family, no real connections, had simply decided the life she married into was too heavy, and she had walked away. Marcus didn't believe a single word of it, but then, 3 months into the search, a call came in the middle of the night. A woman's body had been found. The description matched. And Marcus Whitfield, one of the most powerful men in America, sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, and for the first time since she disappeared, he couldn't move. What happened next, and everything that came before it, is what this story is about. Who Naomi Whitfield really was, who the man who loved her truly was, who the woman sitting cold in that corner was while her son tore through the world looking for his missing pregnant wife, and what had been happening, slowly, quietly, behind closed doors, long before that morning when everything finally broke the surface. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of what was done to Naomi Whitfield, who did it, and whether justice can reach someone who has spent 50 years making sure it never does. And before we go any further, there are 3 questions you need to keep in your mind from this moment forward, because everything you are about to see, every reveal, every answer, every twist you did not see coming, comes back to these 3 questions. The first question is this: how does a woman vanish from a place where disappearing should be impossible? Not a quiet street, not an ordinary neighborhood, a place built to make sure nothing like that could happen. Surrounded by systems, security, wealth, control, and yet she was gone. No sound, no trace, no explanation that made sense. How? That is the first question. The second question is this: who looks at a woman like Naomi Whitfield, pregnant, harmless, someone who never asked for conflict, and decides she should disappear? Not accidentally, not randomly, deliberately. And who has both the hatred and the power to make that decision real? Because someone did. And when you find out who and why they believed they could, you will not see this story the same way again. That is the second question. And then there is the third question. When the person responsible has spent a lifetime making sure consequences never reach them, what does it take to finally bring them down? And what does it cost the one person willing to try? Is justice even possible when power has spent decades protecting itself? That is the third question. Hold on to them, because this story answers every single one. But first, you need to understand who these people were before everything fell apart. Before the morning it broke. Before any of these questions existed. You have to go back to the beginning. And that is exactly where we're going. Every story about power has a beginning. And the beginning of the Whitfield story does not start in a Manhattan penthouse, or a Connecticut estate, or a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the New York skyline. It starts in the dirt, in the South, in the 1940s, with a man who had very little and understood, with the particular sharpness of someone who has lived without, exactly what it would take to change that. His name was Harold Whitfield Sr., and he was a surveyor. Not a wealthy man, not a connected man, not someone whose name meant anything to anyone yet. He spent his days walking land that belonged to other people, measuring it, understanding it, learning its value in ways that the men who owned it rarely bothered to. He was the man who came to do the work. He was not the man who owned the result of the work. Not yet. But Harold Sr. had something that no amount of inheritance could have given him. He had an eye. He could look at a stretch of land that other men dismissed and see what it could become. He could walk a plot that seemed like nothing and understand, in the specific language of soil and geography and potential, that it was worth something significant, worth buying. So he saved, quietly, carefully, without waste, without sentiment. The way men who have grown up with nothing save when they finally have something to save. He bought small parcels of land, then larger ones. He reinvested every return into the next purchase. He built relationships with men who could extend credit to someone who had earned it but not inherited it. He was patient in the way that only people who have never been able to afford impatience are patient. And then, in the early 1950s, Harold Whitfield Sr. purchased a stretch of rural land in Texas that most men in his position would have passed over without a second thought. The price was low. The land looked like nothing. The men around him thought he had made a mistake. Sitting directly beneath that land, undiscovered and untouched, was one of the most productive oil deposits in the region. What followed was not the dramatic overnight transformation that stories sometimes promise. It was slower than that, more deliberate, more real. The oil revenue was reinvested into more land, into real estate, into defense contracting, into relationships and connections, and the kind of reputation that opens doors that money alone cannot open. Harold Sr. built not just a business, but a name. And by the time he passed everything to his son, Harold Jr., the Whitfield name meant something in rooms where names matter. Not just money, something more durable than money. Harold Jr. was a different man than his father. Harold Sr. had been quiet and precise, a man who built through patience and observation. Harold Jr. was broader, more social. He had his father's eye for value, but he wore it differently, with the confidence of someone who had grown up watching the eye work rather than having developed it out of necessity. He understood people the way his father understood land. He knew who to trust and who to watch and how to cultivate both, which is a skill that very few people in the world of business ever fully master. And Harold Jr. made a bet. In the late 1970s, when most of the men in his circle were still thinking about industry in terms of things you could see and touch and hold, Harold Jr. looked at the earliest iterations of what would become the technology infrastructure of the modern world, and he understood something that very few people understood yet. This was not a trend. This was the foundation. Servers, networks, the invisible architecture that everything else would eventually be built on. He invested early. He invested heavily. He moved the Whitfield portfolio from oil and real estate into technology infrastructure at exactly the moment when most people thought he was taking an unnecessary risk. He was not taking a risk. He was reading the future the same way his father had read the land. By the time Harold Jr. passed away at 61, Whitfield Global Industries was worth somewhere north of $3 billion, and it was still growing. His son Marcus was 34 years old when he inherited everything. He had spent nearly a decade working inside the company before that day came, learning it from the inside, understanding its structures, its relationships, its culture, the way you can only understand something by being inside it, rather than observing it from a distance. He was prepared. Not for the grief of losing his father, nobody is ever prepared for that, but for the responsibility of what came next. And when that responsibility arrived, Marcus Whitfield stepped into it without letting feel the weight of the transition. Not for a single day. In the 8 years that followed, Whitfield Global grew from $3 billion to $4.7 billion in valuation. Marcus expanded into sustainable energy infrastructure, into healthcare technology, into international markets his father had identified, but never fully entered. He took what 2 generations of Whitfield men had built, and he made it mean more. He was, by every financial measure available, extraordinary at what he did. But the financial record is not the most important thing to understand about Marcus Whitfield. The most important thing to understand about Marcus Whitfield is the kind of man he was inside the rooms where the financial record was being made. He remembered names. Not as a technique, not as a strategy, simply because he was paying attention when people told him, and he believed that paying attention was the least you owed anyone who was speaking to you. He asked after families. He sat in rooms with people far below his level and gave them the same quality of attention he gave to people at his own. He led with decency in rooms where decency is genuinely rare. And the people who worked closely with him, who saw him every day in the ordinary moments between the significant ones, would tell you that Marcus Whitfield was someone who made you feel like you mattered. Not because he was performing it, because he meant it. That is who Marcus Whitfield was, now. Eleanor Whitfield. She was 64 years old when the events of this story took place. Born Eleanor Beaumont, the daughter of a prominent Southern family whose wealth predated the Whitfields by 2 generations. She had grown up in a world of deliberate and absolute privilege, private schools, a family estate, a social world in which the right connections were as necessary and as natural as breathing. She had been raised to understand that position required maintenance, that the life she had been born into was a performance that has to be sustained through the right choices and the right associations and the right marriages. She had made the right marriage. When Eleanor Beaumont married Harold Jr. Whitfield at 26, it was considered by everyone in their respective circles to be an ideal match. Old, money meeting new trajectory. 2 families whose combined resources and connections could open virtually any door in the country. Eleanor had not needed the Whitfield money to be powerful. She had brought her own. What the marriage gave her was scale, and Eleanor had always understood that scale was everything. What followed was 4 decades of deliberate and patient construction. She moved in political circles not as a candidate, but as something more durable. A donor, a connector, a woman whose phone calls were returned within the hour, by people whose names would stop a conversation if I said them out loud. She sat on boards. She attended the right events. She cultivated over 40 years a network of obligations and loyalties and carefully managed debts that made her, in practical terms, untouchable. She was beautiful in the way that certain women of that generation and that background are beautiful. Deliberately, architecturally, as a form of authority rather than invitation. Pure snow-white hair worn in an immaculate sweep that cost a fortune to maintain and looked entirely effortless. Designer glasses that she used as punctuation, removing them slowly when she wanted you to understand that what she was about to say required your complete attention. Red lipstick applied with the precision of someone who understands that details are never small. Short red nails, always. Clothes from Chanel and Oscar de la Renta and Valentino that announced her position in every room she entered without ever needing to say a word. She was the kind of woman that other women in powerful rooms categorized within 30 seconds of meeting her as someone never to cross. And she had one place where the architecture gave way to something human, her son. Marcus was the only child Eleanor had. Everything she had, all the force of will and love and ambition that she might have distributed across several children, had poured entirely into him. She called him baby into his 40s. She tracked his schedule. She remembered without being told every significant date in his professional life. She attended every important moment. She was present in the specific way of a woman for whom her son's life was the one investment she cared about more than any other. She loved him. Completely. Genuinely. That love was the most real thing about Eleanor Whitfield, and it is where this story truly begins. Because it was that love, and what Eleanor believed that love entitled her to, that set everything else in motion. But before we get there, before we go deeper into Eleanor Whitfield and what lived inside her, behind the white hair and the red lips, and the 40 years of carefully constructed power, you need to understand something else first, something that happened to Eleanor a long time ago. Something she experienced when she was just 16 years old, something she never examined, never healed from, never let go of, a wound. And that wound is where everything that follows in this story has its true beginning. Eleanor Whitfield was not born cruel. That is the first thing you need to understand. The woman you saw in that sitting room, cold and still while her son tore his home apart, did not arrive in the world that way. Something made her. Something specific. Something that happened on a summer afternoon in the early 1970s when she was 16 years old and had not yet learned to be untouchable. And that is exactly where we are going. Beaumont, who was at that particular moment in her life, not yet the woman we have just described to you, not yet the untouchable political force with the white hair and the red lips and the network of favors and the rooms full of people leaning toward her. Not yet any of that. She was just a girl who had grown up in a world of complete and absolute privilege, yes. A girl who had been taught since childhood, not always in words, but always in the specific way the world was arranged around her. That some people matter, and some people serve, and that the two categories do not cross. She had absorbed that lesson the way children absorb the lessons that are never quite spoken out loud. Completely, without examination, without question, the way you absorb the air in the room you grow up in, without ever thinking about whether it is the right kind of air. She had grown up on a grand Southern estate. The Beaumont family home was everything that old Southern money looked like when it had been maintained carefully across several generations. White columns, magnolia trees, manicured grounds, a staff of household workers who appeared when needed and disappeared when not, the invisible architecture of privilege made physical. Eleanor had attended private schools where everyone looked like her and came from families like hers. She had summered at the right places. She had been introduced to the right people. She had been trained from the time she was old enough to understand what training was, in the specific performance of being Eleanor Beaumont. And she had been, underneath all of that performance, quietly lonely. Not in a way she would have named, not in a way she had any language for, but lonely in the specific way of girls who have been so carefully surrounded by the right people that they have never been given the chance to find the real ones. And then she met Della. Della was the daughter of the Beaumont family's groundskeeper. She was 16, the same age as Eleanor, and she had grown up on the edges of the Beaumont estate the way the children of household staff sometimes do. Close enough to the privilege to understand it completely, far enough from it to never mistake it for her own world. She was bright in a way that had never been properly accommodated by the schools available to her. She was funny with the specific timing of someone who has learned to read a room quickly and accurately because reading the room has always mattered more for her than it has for the people in the center of it. And she was, underneath everything, honest in a way that Eleanor had never encountered in any of the right people she had been carefully surrounded by. They found each other the way girls sometimes find each other. Unexpectedly, in an ordinary moment, without the adults in their lives having arranged it or approved it. Eleanor had been reading in the garden. Della had been helping her father with the grounds. Something was said. Something was answered. And something clicked between them that had nothing to do with where either of them had come from, and everything to do with who they actually were when nobody was watching. For 2 years, Eleanor Beaumont had a real friend. Not the performing kind. Not the strategic kind that the world she grew up in was full of. A real one. Someone who said what she thought. Someone who made Eleanor laugh in a way she did not laugh anywhere else. Someone who, in the specific private language of their friendship, made Eleanor feel less like a performance and more like a person. She never told her mother about Della. She understood without being told that this friendship was not something that fit inside the world her mother had built for her. So she kept it in the garden. She kept it in the stolen hours. She kept it in the specific hidden pocket of her life where the performance did not reach. And for 2 years, it was the best thing about being Eleanor Beaumont. Then, the summer of Eleanor's 16th year, something happened to the Beaumont family that threatened to change everything. Her father had been involved, as powerful Southern families sometimes are, in a business arrangement that was not entirely above the surface. Nothing that was ever spoken about directly. Nothing that had a name in polite conversation. But an arrangement that depended, absolutely and entirely, on certain documents remaining private. Certain conversations remaining unrecorded. Certain understandings between certain men remaining understood rather than stated. And then those documents were not private anymore. They found their way to people who should not have had access to them. And the Beaumont family, which had been untouchable in the specific way of families that have been in the same rooms for long enough, suddenly found itself the subject of conversations it had never expected to have in public. The scandal did not destroy the Beaumont family. They were too established for destruction, but it damaged them. It damaged them in the specific way that matters most to families like the Beaumonts. It made them visible. It made their arrangements discussable. It put their name in conversations they had not controlled. And Eleanor, 16 years old, and watching her parents navigate the specific quiet devastation of a private world suddenly becoming partially public, needed somewhere to put what she was feeling. She needed someone to blame. The investigation into how the documents had gotten out was never fully resolved. There were multiple possible explanations, multiple people who had access, multiple avenues through which something private could have become public. But Eleanor did not wait for an investigation. Eleanor looked at who had been close to her, who had had access, even peripheral access, to the edges of her family's private life, who was from a world different from hers, a world that might have had reasons to want the Beaumont family diminished. And she landed on Della. Whether Della had anything to do with it, we cannot know with certainty. Eleanor never asked her directly. Eleanor never gave Della the chance to answer the question because Eleanor never asked it. She simply decided. With the specific, swift certainty of a girl who had been trained to trust her instincts about people, and whose instincts in this moment were being driven entirely by fear and grief, and the need for the terrible thing to have a cause she could locate and hold. She decided Della had betrayed her, and the friendship ended, not with a confrontation, not with an accusation, not with any scene that could be revisited and reconsidered. Eleanor simply stopped coming to the garden, stopped the stolen hours, stopped the hidden pocket of her life where Della had lived. She withdrew the friendship the way you withdraw from something that has burned you, completely and without discussion. Because discussing it would have required sitting in the uncertainty of not quite knowing, and Eleanor Beaumont had decided she was done with uncertainty. Della tried once to find out what had happened. She sent a note. Eleanor did not respond, and that was the end of the only real friendship Eleanor Beaumont would ever have in her life. What happened next happened slowly. Not in a dramatic moment, not in a single decision, but in the gradual, patient, completely unconscious way that wounds that are never examined become beliefs, and beliefs become philosophy, and philosophy becomes the load-bearing wall of an entire personality. Eleanor took what had happened with Della and she built something from it. She told herself a story. The story went like this. She had made the mistake of letting someone from a different world into her real life. Someone who did not belong there. Someone who, despite appearances, despite the warmth and the humor and the 2 years of genuine connection, had ultimately done what people from that world do when they are given access to something they were not born to. They took from it. The story was clean. The story explained everything. The story meant that what had happened was not a tragedy or a complexity or a thing that might have had a dozen different causes. It was a lesson. A simple, clear, instructive lesson about the nature of certain kinds of people. And Eleanor, being Eleanor, did not make the same mistake twice. Over the years that followed, as she moved from 16 to 20 to 30 and beyond, the story calcified. It moved from something she occasionally thought about to something she simply knew. The way you know things that have been true for long enough that you stop noticing you believe them. Poor people are dangerous. They will always resent what you have. They will always, given the opportunity, reach for what is not theirs. They cannot be trusted with proximity to your real life. They are background. They are service. And if they ever forget that, they must be reminded of where they belong. This was not a philosophy, Eleanor announced. She was far too sophisticated for that. Publicly, she was charming, generous at the right charitable events. Gracious in the way of women who understand that grace is a tool. But in private, in the rooms where no one important was watching, Eleanor Whitfield had rules. About who could be close, about who deserved consideration, about who mattered and who did not. And those rules had been in place and had been applied consistently for nearly 50 years. And then one evening Marcus called. He called from New York. He had been at a charity gala. His voice had a quality to it that Eleanor recognized immediately, not because she had heard it before in him, but because she had been listening to his voice her entire life, and she knew every register of it. And this one was new. This one was the voice of her son, telling her something that he already knew was going to matter to her before she had even heard it. He said, "Mom, I need to tell you something. I met someone tonight, and I think she might be the one. I really think she might be." Eleanor listened. She asked the questions a mother asks. She was warm. She was interested. She was everything that Marcus needed her to be in that moment, because Marcus was her son, and his happiness was genuinely the thing she cared about most in the world. And then he told her where this woman had come from, and something moved through Eleanor Whitfield in that moment that she would spend a long time afterward telling herself was concern, maternal concern, the reasonable protective instinct of a mother who wanted the best for her son and who understood the world he moved in and what it required of the people in it. But underneath this story, she told herself about what she felt in that moment was something older and darker and far more specific than concern. It was the wound, 50 years old, never examined, never healed, never given a single honest moment of genuine scrutiny. And it had just been given a new address. You have spent the last part inside Eleanor Whitfield's wound. Now step out of it. Because there is someone else in this story who matters just as much. And she has been waiting long enough. Now, Naomi Carter. Because this story has two centers, and you have met one of them. Now you need to meet the other. And I need you to understand, from the very beginning of this, that Naomi Carter is not a side character in her own story. She is not the woman something happened to. She is not the victim waiting in the wings for the powerful people around her to determine her fate. She is the center, and everything about who she was before any of this happened makes what happens to her not just terrible but specific. Not just sad but enraging. Because the more you understand who Naomi Carter was, the more you understand exactly what was at stake when someone decided she needed to disappear. So let us start at the beginning. Naomi Carter was born in Atlanta, Georgia. She was given up at birth, not abandoned in the cruel, dramatic way that word sometimes implies, surrendered, quietly and entirely, and with whatever complicated mixture of love and impossibility that leads a person to make the hardest decision available to them. Her mother's circumstances made raising a child impossible, and so Naomi was placed in the system. The foster care system in Georgia in the late 1980s was what foster care systems have always been everywhere. A structure built to manage a problem rather than solve it, built around paperwork and placements, and the good intentions of people who were almost always underpaid and sometimes undertrained, and occasionally simply not equal to the specific demands of what they had signed up for. Naomi did not have a single bad experience. She did not have a single good one either, not in the way that leaves a mark on you in the right direction. What she had was a series of arrangements, some of them warm, some of them cold, most of them somewhere here in the middle, which is its own particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of never quite belonging to any of the places you are placed. She moved 7 times before she was 12. 7 bedrooms, 7 sets of house rules, 7 different ways of learning where the kitchen was, and what time dinner happened, and whether the people in this house were the kind who noticed when something was wrong with you, or the kind who needed you to be quiet about it. 7 times of arriving somewhere with a box of her belongings and understanding, without being told that the appropriate response to a new place was not to make yourself at home too quickly, because home had a way of ending. But Naomi Carter did something with those 7 moves that a lot of children in her position do not manage to do. She did not close. She did not harden. She did not build the specific armor that temporary rooms sometimes build in the people who live in them. The armor of not caring, of not trying, of deciding that if things are going to be taken away anyway, then it is better not to want them in the first place. Instead, she decided something. She could not have told you when she decided it. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not a conscious choice made in front of a mirror or a declaration made to herself on a particular morning. It was the kind of decision that happens slowly, in the accumulated weight of many ordinary moments, until one day you look up and realize that you have been living by it for so long that it has become simply who you are. She decided that the one thing she could control, in a life where almost nothing was controlled, was how she showed up for other people. Not for herself. not for the places she lived, or the people she was assigned to, or the systems she moved through. For the people around her, whoever they happened to be, in whatever temporary arrangement she happened to be in. She would show up for them. She would be the person who noticed, the person who helped without being asked, the person who made things slightly better in whatever small way was available to her. Not because she expected anything back, not because she was keeping score, not because she believed the world was fair and that kindness would be returned in kind. She had seen enough through by the time she was 10 to know that the world was not reliably fair and that kindness was not reliably returned. She did it because it was the one thing that was entirely hers. Her decency, her specific quality of showing up. In a life where almost everything else could be rearranged or removed or replaced without her permission, this was the one thing that nobody could take from her unless she gave it up herself. And Naomi Carter never gave it up. She also had, and this is important, a dry sense of humor that caught people completely off guard. She had opinions, strong ones, delivered quietly and without apology. She had edges in the specific way of people who have had to figure out the world for themselves, and therefore do not have much patience for people who have had every advantage and still cannot manage to be decent. She was not soft. She was not endlessly accommodating. She was kind, which is a completely different thing, and the difference mattered enormously, she cried. Let that be said clearly. She cried in the specific way of people who never cry in public, alone, in whatever room she had to herself, in the late hours of the night when the day was done, and there was nobody to be strong for. She cried because she was human, and because growing up without a single person who was unconditionally yours is genuinely hard, and grief does not become less real because you are accustomed to it. She cried, and then she stopped, and she got up the next morning, and she showed up every time, without fail, without complaint, without anyone knowing. She aged out of the foster system at 18, with a small bag of belongings. No family to call, safety net of any kind, and the specific clarity of someone who has known for a long time that if something is going to happen, it is going to happen because she makes it happen. She got a job cleaning offices the week she turned 18. She saved every dollar she did not need for food and the cheapest available room in a shared house. She applied for every scholarship she could find. She enrolled in community college the following September. What followed were 4 years that I want you to sit with for a moment. Because 4 years of community college while working full-time cleaning offices is not an abstraction. It is a specific physical reality. It is getting up before 5 in the morning to clean a building before it opens. It is going to class on 3 hours of sleep. It is studying in the break room during a 30-minute lunch. It is the specific calculation of a person who is managing a budget with no margin for error. This much for rent, this much for food, this much for the textbook I need. Nothing left over, nothing saved, nothing wasted. It is doing all of that without a single person in the world whose job it is to make sure you are okay. And Naomi did it. She did it with the grades that earned her a transfer to a 4-year university on a partial scholarship. She did it with the determination of someone who understands, at a cellular level, that education is not an opportunity. It is a door. And doors, in Naomi's experience, had a way of closing. So you went through them while they were open. She graduated. She built her event coordination career from the ground up, the way she built everything. Without anyone's help, without anyone's investment, without anyone's name attached to it except hers. She was good at it in the specific way of people who are good at things because they have had to be, rather than because it came easily. She noticed things other coordinators missed. She anticipated problems before they became visible. She managed the chaos of a large event with the calm of someone who has been managing in unpredictable circumstances her entire life and has simply transferred that skill into a professional context. Her clients told her repeatedly that she was better than they had expected. She heard that often enough that she stopped being surprised by it. She did not know whether they meant it as a compliment or as something else. She had decided, a long time ago, not to spend too much energy on that question. She simply did the work. She did it well. She moved on to the next thing, and quietly, carefully, privately, she began to save. Not for anything specific yet, just towards something. The sense that one day she wanted to have something that was entirely hers, built by her hands, with no temporary arrangement attached to it. No placement that could end, no system she was moving through. Something permanent, something that had her name on it and nobody else's. She saved the way she did everything. Without drama, without announcing it, without expecting anyone to notice or approve. That was Naomi Carter. That was the woman, before any of this happened. And now there is one more thing you need to know about her. One moment. That happened when she was 10 years old, on a summer afternoon in Atlanta. That she did not remember, but that someone else never forgot. It was the summer of 1992. Naomi was 10 years old and living in her fourth foster placement, a group home on the south side of Atlanta, run by a woman named Miss Patricia, who was strict and fair, and occasionally warm in the specific rationed way of people who have learned not to get too attached. The group home was on a residential street, modest and clean, the kind of neighborhood that working people lived in and took care of, even when the taking care required more effort than it should have. Naomi had gone to the corner store that afternoon for a bottle of water, $2. She had saved it from the small weekly allowance Miss Patricia gave the children in the house. She was on her way back when she turned a corner into a parking lot and saw something that stopped her. A boy, white, blonde, maybe 12 years old, wearing clothes that cost more than most of the furniture in Miss Patricia's group home. Standing very still in the middle of the parking lot with 3 older teenagers around him, and the specific quality of stillness that belongs to someone who is frightened and has run out of ideas about what to do about it. One of the teenagers had his hand out. He wanted the watch on the boy's wrist. The boy was not moving. He did not know what to do. He was 12 years old, and he had never been in a situation that his life had not equipped him to handle, and this was one of those situations. Naomi Carter looked at this scene for approximately 2 seconds, and then she walked directly into the middle of it. She did not run. She did not shout from a distance. She walked, calmly, with the specific unhurried confidence of someone who has decided what she is going to do and is simply doing it. She placed herself between the teenagers and the boy. She spread her arms slightly. She looked at the teenagers and she said, in a voice that was much larger than a 10-year-old body should have been able to produce, "You leave him alone right now." She did not know this boy. She did not owe him anything. She had no way of knowing whether what she was doing was going to work or whether it was going to make things worse. She simply saw a person who needed help, and she could not make herself walk past it. That was the wiring. That was the decision she had made, somewhere in the accumulated weight of 4 placements and many ordinary moments, about the kind of person she was going to be. The teenagers looked at her. There is something specific about a 10-year-old who is completely unafraid that is very difficult to argue with. Not because it is threatening, because it is disarming in a way that aggression is not. They backed off, not gracefully, not with any acknowledgement of what had just happened, but they left. And the blonde boy stood in the parking lot breathing, and Naomi Carter looked at him and said, "Are you okay?" He nodded. She said, "You should probably go find whoever you came here with." He nodded again, and she turned and walked back toward Miss Patricia's group home with her bottle of water. She did not think about it again. It was not a story she told. It was not a memory she filed under significant. It was simply a thing she had done because it was obviously the thing to do. And then the afternoon had continued, and then the day had ended, and then 12 years had passed, and then 20, and then 30. She did not remember it. He never forgot it. Marcus Whitfield was 40 years old when he walked into a charity gala in New York City and saw a woman across the room who stopped him mid-sentence. He had been in conversation with someone important. He could not have told you afterward who it was, because across the room, standing near an event coordination station, with a tablet in her hand and a small earpiece, and the specific focused calm of someone who is running a large event smoothly and making it look easy, was a woman with gray eyes. Not just gray, a specific gray. The particular luminous gray of a pair of eyes he had been carrying in his memory for 30 years, without quite knowing he had been carrying them. He had never been able to describe them properly when he tried. But he recognized them the moment he saw them. He excused himself from the conversation. He crossed the room. She was working. She did not notice him approaching until he was a few feet away and stopped. And she looked up from her tablet with the professional attention of an event coordinator, assessing whether an approaching guest needed something. He said, "I think I owe you something from about 30 years ago." She looked at him. the professional attention shifted into something more personal. Curiosity, assessment, the specific look of a woman who reads people quickly and accurately and is reading this one, she said. Most debts from 30 years ago aren't worth collecting, he said. This one is. I was 12 years old in a parking lot in Atlanta, and a 10-year-old girl walked into the middle of something she had absolutely no reason to walk into, and she made a decision that I have thought about more times than I can count. Naomi looked at him. She did not remember. She would not have remembered, even if he had described it in more detail. It was not the kind of thing she had filed as significant. But she looked at this man, this tall blonde man with the honey amber eyes that were doing something she had learned to read in people's eyes. He was telling the truth. Completely. Without agenda. He was standing in front of her, telling her something true, and she could see it. She said, I don't remember that. He said, I know. That is actually the part that I have always found the most remarkable about it. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, full and genuine and slightly surprised out of her. The specific laugh of someone who has been caught off guard by something they did not expect to be as good as it was. She said, a man who keeps a 30-year debt, that is either very honorable or very dangerous. He said, I guess you are going to have to find out. They dated for 8 months. And in those 8 months, Marcus Whitfield was, by every account of the people who saw them together, a man who had found exactly what he had been looking for, and was treating it with the specific care of someone who understands what something is worth. He was present, not in the performed way of men who want to seem present, in the actual way of someone who remembers what you said last Tuesday and asks about it on Saturday. He read to her in the evenings because she mentioned once, quietly, that she had never had bedtime stories as a child. He learned how she took her tea. He remembered the names of every person she mentioned in passing. He was not trying to impress her with gestures. He was needlessly paying attention. And for a woman who had spent her entire life in arrangements where nobody's specific job it was to pay attention to her, being the subject of Marcus Whitfield's attention, was something she had to learn how to ranty without deflecting. She deflected at first, gently, with humor, with the specific self-sufficiency of someone who has been entirely self-sufficient for so long that being cared for feels like a language she almost understands, but has never been quite fluent in. He was patient with the deflection the way he was patient with everything. And slowly, over 8 months of evenings and conversations, and the specific accumulated weight of someone showing up consistently and without agenda, Naomi Carter let herself believe that this was real. On month 9, Marcus proposed. He did not make a production of it. He did not arrange a spectacle. He understood, from 8 months of paying attention, that Naomi was not a woman who needed a spectacle. She needed something true. So he took her somewhere private, and he told her the truth. That he had recognized her across a room 30 years after the afternoon in Atlanta, and that every day since had confirmed what that moment had told him instantly. That she was the most remarkable person he had ever met. That he wanted to spend the rest of his life paying attention to her. And then he asked her to marry him. She said yes, and then she cried. Not delicately, not prettily. She cried in the full unguarded way of someone who has spent a lifetime being strong in public and has just been given a moment private enough to be completely honest in. He held her while she cried and did not say anything because he understood, from 8 months of paying attention, that she did not need him to say anything. She just needed him to stay. And he stayed after, when she had stopped and straightened and looked at him with those gray eyes still wet, and her expression somewhere between embarrassed and completely at peace. She said, I need you to know that I am a person who is going to cry at things like this, and I am not going to apologize for it, he said. I would not want you to, she said. Good, and that was that. Marcus called his mother that evening to tell her he had found the woman he wanted to spend his life with. Eleanor's voice on the phone was warm, interested. She asked the questions a mother asks. Where did you meet her? What is she like? When do I get to meet her? She was everything that Marcus needed her to be in that conversation. She said, I cannot wait to meet her. Marcus hung up the phone feeling, for the first time in his life, that everything was exactly as it should be. Eleanor Whitfield met Naomi Carter for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in October, 3 weeks after Marcus had made the call that had woken the wound up. Marcus had arranged the meeting with the specific care of a man who understood that what happened in the next few hours mattered enormously. He had chosen a lunch at the Connecticut estate rather than a restaurant because the estate was Eleanor's ground. And he understood that Eleanor performed better when she felt sovereign. He had told Naomi to expect Eleanor to be formal at first, to give her time, to not be discouraged if the warmth took a while to arrive. He had done all of this because he loved both women, and because he was, as we have established, a man who paid attention and who wanted this to work. What he had not accounted for was that Eleanor did not need time to warm up. Eleanor Whitfield arrived in the estate's main sitting room looking breathtaking, as she always did, in a structured Chanel suit in ivory deep red, her snow-white hair immaculate, her red lips precise, her designer glasses in place. She walked toward Naomi with both hands slightly extended, the specific body language of a woman welcoming someone into her home, and she said, "Naomi, I have been looking forward to this so much. Marcus has told me so little, which is completely typical of him, and I want to hear everything from you directly." Naomi, who had been prepared for coldness and had not been prepared for this, felt something in her chest loosen slightly. She smiled. She took Eleanor's hands. She said, "It is wonderful to meet you." And she meant it because Naomi Carter always meant what she said. Eleanor asked her about her work. She listened with every visible sign of genuine interest, her head tilted slightly, her eyes attentive, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she had actually processed the previous answer. She complimented the dress Naomi was wearing, a breathtaking fitted cashmere meaty dress in nude, with the specific appreciative eye of a woman who understood quality when she saw it. She touched Naomi's arm once, lightly. A warm, brief contact that said you belong here without saying anything at all. Marcus sat slightly back from the two of them, watching, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Relief so strong it was almost physical. His mother was trying. His mother was genuinely trying. He could see it. He picked up his wine glass and looked at the two women he loved most in the world, talking easily in the sitting room of the estate that had been in his family for 3 generations, and he told himself, "This is going to be all right." He was looking at the right room. He was not looking at the right thing. Because Eleanor Whitfield's performance in that sitting room was the finest she had ever given. It was 40 years of practice deployed at full capacity against a single specific target. And Naomi Carter, who was extraordinary at reading people in the ordinary run of things, had never in her life encountered someone who performed warmth this completely. She had encountered cold people who pretended to be warm. She had encountered warm people who occasionally failed to perform it. She had never encountered a person for whom warmth was a costume so thoroughly constructed that it had no seam, no catch, no single visible place where the fabric parted and showed you what was underneath. That afternoon, Naomi gave Eleanor the benefit of the doubt. Eleanor was driven out that evening to a late political meeting downtown in complete silence. Her assistant, a woman named Catherine, who had worked for Eleanor for 9 years, and who had learned to read the quality of Eleanor's silences, the way a sailor reads weather, said nothing for the entire 40-minute journey. She did not attempt conversation. She did not put music on. She watched the road and let Eleanor be silent, because Catherine understood, without needing it explained, that this particular silence was not emptiness. It was processing. Eleanor Whitfield in this kind of silence was like a room where something very precise was being measured before being acted upon. You did not interrupt the measuring. What Eleanor had observed at that lunch was this: Naomi Carter was not what she had expected. She had expected someone obvious. Someone who could be caught performing, who could be found reaching for things she had not been born to, who could be made to feel out of place by the weight of the estate and the history in its walls, and the specific gravity of the Whitfield name. She had expected someone who could be handled with standard tools. Naomi Carter was not that person. She was poised without performing it. She was warm without needing it returned. She moved through the estate as though the grandeur of it was simply a place she happened to be, neither intimidated by it nor trying to prove she belonged in it. She looked at Mark the way Eleanor had spent 40 years hoping someone would look at her son, with the specific attention of someone who has found what they were looking for and is still slightly amazed by it. She was, Eleanor understood in the silence of the car, genuinely extraordinary, And that made her considerably more dangerous than Eleanor had anticipated, because a woman who could be dismissed was not a problem. A woman this real, this present, this completely herself in a room designed to diminish people who had not been born to it, was the kind of problem that required a different kind of solution. Eleanor looked out the car window at the Connecticut road unspooling in the dark, and she began to plan. What followed was not dramatic. This is important to understand. Eleanor Whitfield did not declare war. She did not make speeches. She did not even raise her voice. What she did was quieter and more precise and far more devastating than any of those things. She eroded. She worked the way water works on stone. Slowly, at the same places every time, without drama, without announcement, until the shape of the thing had changed entirely without any single moment you could point to as the cause. It began in small things. The way Eleanor would survey a room that Naomi had arranged, and then rearrange one element of it, wordlessly, as though Naomi's arrangement had simply been a first draft. The way she would refer to the household staff's work as having been done when Marcus asked about something, erasing whatever contribution Naomi had made. The way she would ask Naomi questions at dinner that were structured to reveal gaps. Did you follow the Alderman acquisition, Naomi? It has been in the financial pages all week, the specific implication being that someone who had not followed it was perhaps not quite equipped for the world she had married into. And then there were the comments. Eleanor had a gift for comments. She delivered them in the specific tone of a woman who is being helpful, the tone that said, I am sharing this because I care about you, and I want you to have the information you need to navigate this world successfully. The tone that was indistinguishable from genuine concern, unless you had spent a very long time listening to genuine concern and understood, at the bone level, what it actually sounded like. One afternoon, several months into the marriage, Naomi was in the estate's main kitchen, making herself a cup of tea. It was mid-morning. Marcus was in the city. The kitchen was hers in the way that a kitchen is yours when you live somewhere and are the only person awake in it, a temporary private sovereignty that felt real enough. She was standing at the marble counter in a beautiful cashmere wrap dress, her natural hair loose around her face, humming something quietly to herself. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She did not come into the kitchen. She stood in the doorway in a breathtaking structured Valentino suit in deep forest green, her white hair immaculate, her red lips precise, and she looked at Naomi with an expression of pleasant, mild concern, the way you look at something that is slightly out of place. She said, Naomi, darling, that is what Maria is here for. Naomi looked at her. She said, I just wanted a cup of tea, Eleanor. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. She said, Of course. I only mention it because the staff find it slightly uncomfortable when... She paused. Well, when the lines become blurred. It makes their role unclear. I am sure you understand. And then she smiled. And then she left. Naomi stood at the marble counter with her cup of tea. The kitchen was exactly as it had been before Eleanor appeared. Nothing had changed. And yet something in the air of it had changed entirely. The way a room changes when someone has said something that cannot be unsaid, even when what they said was technically nothing at all. She drank her tea. She washed the cup, she put it away. She went upstairs to the room she shared with Marcus, and she sat on the edge of the bed and she breathed. Once, twice, 3 times. She did not cry. Not yet. Not until later that night, when Marcus was asleep, and she had gone on to the ensuite bathroom and turned the tap on, so the sound of the water covered whatever sound she might make. This was the rhythm. Eleanor would say something or do something or arrange something. Naomi would absorb it. Naomi would find a private space to process it, and then she would appear at the next meal, or the next gathering, or the next ordinary moment of family life exactly as she always appeared. Present, warm, entirely herself. And Eleanor would watch, and she would understand that Naomi had not broken, and she would adjust. There was the afternoon Eleanor spoke to the estate's housekeeper Maria, while Naomi was in the adjacent room and could hear every word but could not see either of them without making her presence known. Eleanor's voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant when she was being specific. She said, Maria, I want you to understand something. Mrs. Whitfield is a lovely woman. She is just not accustomed to certain things. If she asks you to do something that seems unusual, or if she makes requests that are outside the normal running of the house, please come to me first. I only want to make sure we are all operating from the same page. You understand. Maria had worked at the estate for 11 years. She understood everything that was being said and everything that was not being said. She said, "Yes, Mrs. Whitfield." She meant the older Mrs. Whitfield. She had learned very quickly which Mrs. Whitfield to mean. Naomi stood in the adjacent room and heard every word. She felt the floor of something shift beneath her. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way ground shifts in the early stages of something that is going to be much larger. She had just been told, in the most pleasant possible terms, that the staff of her own home had been instructed to rout around her, to treat her as a well-meaning visitor, rather than the woman of the house. She walked to the window at the far end of the corridor, and she stood there for a moment, looking at the Connecticut grounds outside. And then she turned and went to find Marcus's home office manager to discuss an event she was helping coordinate for one of Marcus's corporate contacts. Because she was Naomi Carter, and the ground could shift slightly, and she would find her footing and keep moving. Then there was the evening Marcus came home. He came through the front door at 7 in the evening, and he called Naomi's name the way he always did. The specific quality of a man who needs to locate the person he loves before he can fully be in a place, and Naomi called back from the sitting room. But before he reached the sitting room, Eleanor had materialized at the top of the landing. In a breathtaking Oscar de la Renta evening dress she had apparently been wearing for a dinner she had just returned from. And she said, "Baby." Her voice did something specific when she said it. It softened and lifted simultaneously, the specific register of a woman for whom this person's arrival is the arrival of something irreplaceable. She came down the stairs with her arms slightly open, and Marcus, who was in his 40s and had been coming home to this greeting his entire adult life, submitted to it with the fond resignation of a man who has long since stopped arguing with certain things. He said, "Mom, I keep telling you," she said, "and I keep not listening. Come here." She took his face in both hands, her short red nails visible against his jaw, and she looked at him with the expression that was the most real thing about her. The love. The complete, unperformable love of a woman for her only child. And then she said, over his shoulder, to Naomi, who had appeared in the sitting room doorway, "Naomi, darling, we were just saying earlier how tired you look. You really should rest more. It is important. Marcus, make sure she rests." Marcus looked at Naomi. He said, "Are you okay?" "You do look a little tired," Naomi said. "I'm fine. I'm not tired." She kept her voice even. She kept her expression warm. She looked at Marcus and not at Eleanor. Eleanor had already moved on to asking Marcus about his day. That was the architecture of it. The comment so reasonable that Marcus could not have named what was wrong with it, even if he had been trying. The specific placement of it in the moment of his arrival, when his attention was naturally on Eleanor, and his concern was naturally activated by the word tired. The way it created a triangulation. Eleanor noticing Naomi's well-being, Marcus caring about Naomi's well-being, Naomi having to manage her own response while both of them were looking at her. It was engineered. Every single element of it was engineered, and Eleanor had delivered it in the tone of a woman making gentle conversation. Marcus had paused at the top of the stairs once. Only once. It was a Tuesday afternoon, earlier in the marriage, before the pattern had fully established itself. He had come home unexpectedly early from a meeting that had been canceled, and he had parked the car and come through the side entrance, and was making his way toward the main rooms when he heard Eleanor's voice from the sitting room. It had a quality to it that stopped him, not the words. He could not quite make out the words from where he was, but the music of her voice, the specific register of it. It was not the Eleanor with Marcus register, which he knew as well as he knew his own breathing. It was something else, something lower, something with an edge in it that the Eleanor with Marcus register never had. He stood at the top of the stairs and he listened. And then Naomi said something, quietly, and Eleanor's voice shifted. Instantly, completely, the way a light shifts when someone flips a switch. By the time Marcus had descended the stairs and appeared in the doorway, Eleanor was warm and present, and slightly surprised to see him home early, and Naomi was standing near the window, with her hands folded and her face composed, and her gray eyes meeting his with the specific quality of a woman who has decided not to say something. He said, "Everything all right?" Eleanor said, "Marcus, baby, you are home early. How lovely. Come and sit down. Can I get you anything?" Naomi said, "I'm fine." Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at his wife. He looked at his mother. Something was in the room that had not been in it a moment ago. Or rather, something was not in the room that should have been. A specific ease, a specific quality of two people who were genuinely comfortable with each other. He could feel its absence the way you feel a draft before you locate the open window. He did not name it. He did not pursue it. He told himself, it takes time. He told himself, my mother is not easy and Naomi is new and these things take time. He walked into the room. He kissed Naomi. He accepted a drink from Eleanor. He sat down. And the evening continued in the way that evenings continue when people have agreed, without discussing it, to let something pass. But something had been registered. Somewhere below the level of the conversation, something had been registered. And it would stay registered quietly in a room inside Marcus that he did not visit often, but that he did not forget. Naomi did not tell him. People ask why. People always ask why. And I want to answer that question with the full weight of what it deserves. Naomi Carter had spent her entire childhood in situations where the power was held by someone else and her options were comply and stay or resist and leave. She had learned, across 7 placements and many difficult ordinary moments, that the people who held the power rarely changed their minds when challenged directly. What they did, when challenged directly, was become more certain of whatever they had already decided about you. The smart strategy, the survival strategy, was to make yourself as easy to accommodate as possible, while quietly building toward the exit. That was not a strategy she had chosen consciously. It was a strategy she had absorbed so completely that it had become reflex. And Eleanor Whitfield had identified that reflex in the first 30 minutes of knowing Naomi Carter. And she had aimed everything she was doing directly at it. What Naomi did instead was save. Marcus gave her a personal allowance every month that was, by any standard, extraordinary. He had insisted on it from the beginning of their marriage, because Marcus's specific expression of love was the removal of every possible source of anxiety from the life of the person he loved. He had said, "You should not have to think about money ever again if you do not want to. It is not something you will have to carry anymore." Naomi had received this with the complicated gratitude of someone who is genuinely touched by a gesture and simultaneously is unable to fully accept it. She was not built for the dependency that the gesture implied. She never had been, so she thanked him and she meant the thanks. And then she took the allowance every month and she split it. Some of it she spent on the things a woman in her position might reasonably spend it on. And some of it she moved, quietly, into an account that had only her name on it, that she had opened before the wedding, that she had never mentioned to Marcus, because it was not about Marcus. It was about the thing she had always been building toward. The business. The ground. The permanent thing with her name on it and nobody else's. It was also, though she would not have described it this way, the one place in her life inside that estate where Eleanor could not reach her. Every deposit was an act of preservation. Every month that the account grew was a month she had survived something and remained intact. She sat at the kitchen table in the late hours when Marcus was asleep, and she opened the account on her laptop, and she looked at the number. And the number said, "You are still here. You are still building. Whatever is happening in the rooms of this house, you are still standing on ground that is entirely yours." She cried too. In the bathroom. In the car on the way back from events when she was alone. In brief, private moments between the public ones. She cried the way she had always cried. Completely, privately, without performance. And then she stopped, and she showed up. The Naomi that the world saw, the Naomi that Marcus saw, was composed and warm and entirely herself. What was underneath it was not weakness. What was underneath it was a woman who was doing what she had always done in situations where the power was not hers. She was surviving until she could leave on her own terms. She had not yet understood, not fully, that Eleanor was not a difficult person to be navigated. Eleanor was a person who had made a decision. And decisions of the kind Eleanor had made do not negotiate. That understanding was coming. But not yet. Before we get to the pregnancy, there is something that happened. 3 months before Naomi took the test that you need to know about. A Tuesday afternoon in the Connecticut estate. Marcus was in Singapore on a 3-day business trip. The house had the specific quality of a large house when the person who anchors it is away. Quieter, slightly more formal. The staff moving through it with less warmth and more efficiency. Naomi had been in the upstairs corridor moving toward the library, a book under her arm, her natural hair loose, wearing a gorgeous light pink chiffon gown. She was thinking about something entirely unrelated to Eleanor. She was, in the specific way that Naomi moved through most of her days in that house, simply living in it, simply being there. Eleanor appeared from the opposite end of the corridor. She was dressed, as she always was, in a breathtaking, structured suit, this one in deep plum Chanel with pearl buttons, her white hair immaculate, her red lips precise, her short red nails at her sides. She walked toward Naomi at her normal pace, the unhurried, deliberate pace of a woman who has never needed to rush, because the world has always accommodated her timeline, and she was going to pass Naomi. She was going to continue down the corridor, and Naomi was going to continue toward the library. And it was going to be one of those corridor moments that happen in large houses between people who live in them. Brief, neutral, unremarkable. And then Eleanor stopped. She stopped as though she had just remembered something. The specific body language of a woman who has just recalled a small piece of information that she wanted to pass along, the kind of thing you might mention to a neighbor over a fence about something administrative and slightly inconvenient. She turned back to Naomi. She tilted her head very slightly, and she said, in the voice she used for things she wanted to sound like nothing, while meaning everything, "Naomi." She paused for one beat, the kind of pause that made the name itself feel like something Eleanor was placing carefully on a surface. She said, "I want to say something to you, and I want you to hear it as the kindness it is intended to be. Because I do care about you, in my own way, and I care about my son, and I want what is best for both of you. I would not be doing my job as his mother if I did not say what I am about to say." She paused again. She looked at Naomi from her position at the far end of the corridor, with the specific quality of a woman who was about to give a kindness and a verdict in the same sentence. She said, "Darling, you are a lovely young woman. Anyone can see that. Marcus saw it. I have tried to see it. And I want you to understand that I say what I am about to say with no malice in it whatsoever. But you and I both know there are certain worlds that a woman is born into, and there are certain worlds that a woman walks into. And those two things are not the same thing. They are never the same thing. And the woman who has walked in, no matter how lovely she is, no matter how much she is loved by the man who brought her there, will always carry a particular weight that the woman born into it does not have to carry." She tilted her head slightly to the other side. She said, "I think you are beginning to feel that weight. I see it on you sometimes. The little adjustments, the careful way you move, the way you look at a room before you enter it. I noticed. A mother notices things, darling. And I have wondered, more than once, whether this life is going to be a kind one to you in the long run, whether the things that come with this name are going to sit easily on someone who did not grow up wearing it." She paused once more. She said, "And now there is the question of a child." The word child sat between them in the corridor, with the specific weight of a stone placed deliberately on a table. She said, "A child changes everything. A child puts down roots. A child makes a woman permanent in a way she was not permanent before. A child carries the name. A child inherits the world. A child binds a woman to a family for the rest of her life, and to a family that this woman is going to have to answer to in ways she has not yet been asked to answer. And I want you to think very carefully, darling, about whether you are ready for that, about whether you understand what it actually means, about whether you have considered, fully considered, what bringing a child into this house will cost you. Because it will cost you something, Naomi, and I do not think you have any idea yet how much." She paused. She said, more softly now, in the voice that sounded the most like kindness, and was therefore the most dangerous. "If you bring a child into this house, things will become very complicated for you. Very complicated. I want you to hear me. I do not think you want complications. I really do not. A woman in your particular situation should think carefully about how much complication she can carry before it begins to carry her." She smiled. The smile that said, "I have said what needed to be said, and I am now continuing with my day." And she turned and continued down the corridor, and her heels made their specific, precise sound on the marble floor until she turned a corner, and the sound stopped. Naomi stood where she was. The corridor was exactly as it had been before Eleanor appeared in it. The same marble floors, the same afternoon light from the tall windows, the same fresh flowers on the console table at the end. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The way it always changed when Eleanor said something, which was to say without anything in the room moving, without any visible evidence of impact. The air of the place had become different. She stood there for a moment. Her hand had moved, without her noticing it, to rest against her stomach, the specific protective gesture of a woman who was not yet pregnant, but had been thinking about it for months. The body doing what the mind had not yet caught up to doing. She lowered her hand, she breathed. The words sat on her in stages. The first stage was the weight of them, the specific quality of having been told, calmly and at length, that she did not belong somewhere she had been told she belonged. The second stage was the recognition that she had been told this in the most polite possible language by a woman who had smiled while saying it. The third stage was the slower, more uncomfortable understanding that there had been a warning underneath the warning, that Eleanor had not been speaking about complication in the abstract. She had been speaking about something specific, something she could see, something Naomi could not. Naomi did not let herself sit with the third stage, not in that corridor, not at that moment. And then she continued toward the library. She sat down with her book, and she opened it, and she read the same paragraph 4 times before she could actually receive the words on the page. The paragraph was about something ordinary. It refused to take meaning. The meaning of the corridor kept arriving over the top of it, the specific cadence of Eleanor's voice replaying itself. A child changes everything. Things will become very complicated for you. I do not think you want complicated. She closed her eyes. She breathed. And then she decided, because Naomi Carter had always been a person who decided rather than dwelled, that she was going to make these words mean something she could carry rather than something she could not. She told herself, Eleanor is a woman of a particular generation, raised in a particular world, who genuinely believes that the most loving thing a mother-in-law can do is be honest. That world has its own rules about what loving honesty sounds like, and those rules do not always travel well into ordinary kindness. Eleanor was raised to confuse the two. She was raised to believe that a warning is a form of care, that telling a younger woman what she is not equipped for is a service rather than an injury. Eleanor was not trying to wound. Eleanor was doing what she had been taught was the appropriate motherly duty, pointing out the rocks in the river before the younger woman drowned. She told herself, powerful women of Eleanor's generation often did not know how they sounded. They had spent their whole lives being listened to, and very little of their lives being received by people who had not been born to receive them. Eleanor had probably never had a conversation in her adult life where her words landed the way they had just landed in this corridor, because Eleanor had probably never spoken to a person like Naomi before in any sustained way. The unkindness was not deliberate. The unkindness was a side effect of a worldview Eleanor had never been asked to examine, she told herself. The part about the child was not malicious. It was a frightened mother worried about losing her son to a new family. It was Eleanor expressing in the only language she knew the specific fear of a woman whose entire identity had been wrapped around being Marcus's most important person. The complication Eleanor was warning about was not a threat. It was the complication of a family reorganizing itself, of a mother having to accept she was no longer the primary, of an older woman struggling to make room for what was coming. These were the things Eleanor was actually afraid of. She had simply not been able to say them directly. Naomi opened her eyes. She closed the book. She went downstairs. She made herself a cup of tea in her own kitchen. She drank it slowly. She did not cry. Not about this. Not yet. She was wrong about what the words meant. The third stage of the speech, the one she had refused to sit with in the corridor, was the one closest to the truth of what Eleanor was actually saying. But she was not foolish for refusing it. She was simply, as she had always been, choosing to believe that Eleanor was capable of meaning her words more generously than they had sounded. Because Naomi Carter had spent her whole life being the person who chose the more generous interpretation, and she had not yet been given a reason in this house to stop choosing it. That reason was coming, but not yet. 3 months later, on an ordinary morning in September, Naomi Carter took a pregnancy test. She had been feeling different for 2 weeks. Not ill exactly, just different. The specific quality of different that she had no previous experience of, and therefore no language for. until she was standing in the marble ensuite bathroom of the Connecticut estate master bedroom at 7 in the morning, with a test in her hand and the result in front of her, and the language arrived all at once in the form of 2 lines. She sat down on the cold marble floor, not because she was unwell, because the weight of what she was holding required her to be closer to the ground. She pressed her back against the side of the bathtub. She held the test in both hands, and she sat with what was happening in her body, which was not one thing, but several things arising simultaneously and needing to be processed in the order of their importance. The first thing was joy. Joy so complete and so specific and so unambiguous that it briefly, beautifully swept every other thing out of the room. She was going to be a mother. She who had grown up without one. She who had spent her entire childhood in the system, wondering, in the specific, inarticulate way of children, what it would feel like to have someone who was unconditionally yours. She was going to be someone's unconditional person. She was going to be the one who was always there, the one who noticed, the one who showed up. She pressed her hand to her sternum because she needed something to hold on to while she felt the size of it. The second thing was quieter. It arrived underneath the joy like a current beneath still water, barely perceptible on the surface, unmistakably present if you knew how to look for it. It was the memory of a corridor, of Eleanor's voice delivering something dressed as kindness, of the specific quality of a sentence that had been aimed very carefully at a very specific target. Naomi breathed. She looked at the test in her hands. She took the second thing, and she put it in the place where she put things she was not ready to examine. Behind the joy, underneath the joy, next to the other things she carried that she had decided were not going to determine how she moved through the world. And she sat on the cold marble floor of the most expensive bathroom she had ever been in, and she let the joy have the room. She took 4 more tests over the next 2 days. All of them said the same thing. On the evening of the second day, Marcus came home from the office to find the house lit with candles. Not dramatically, not every candle in every room. Just the specific candles that Naomi had placed with care. On the dining room table, along the window ledges, on the sideboard. The quality of light in the dining room was warm and private, in a way the dining room's cathedral ceiling and marble floors rarely allowed it to be. He noticed it the moment he walked through the door and set down his briefcase, and he felt the specific alertness of a man who knows that something has been prepared and does not yet know what. Naomi was at the dining room table when he came in, wearing a breathtaking silk wrap dress in deep burgundy that she had chosen with care. Her natural hair loose and full, her gray eyes watching him come through the door. Beside his plate, a small box simply wrapped. He said, "What is this?" She said, "Sit down and open it." He sat. He picked up the box. He turned it over in his hands once, the specific gesture of someone who is giving themselves one moment before the unknown becomes known. And then he opened it. Inside, the pregnancy test, the first one. The one she had sat with on the marble bathroom floor, and underneath it, a small card in Naomi's neat, precise handwriting. "You are going to be someone's father. Try not to ugly cry." He read it once, he read it again. For 3 full seconds he was completely still, which was the amount of time it took for what he was reading to travel from his eyes to his heart. And then he stood up so fast, the dining chair scraped back across the marble floor, and he was around the table, and Naomi was standing. And he lifted her, carefully, instinctively careful, in a way he had not been deliberate about, and they stood in the middle of the candlelit night dining room. And he said things that did not form complete sentences, because he was too overwhelmed to complete any of them. He said, "Are you, is this, Naomi, is this, oh my God?" She laughed into his shoulder. She cried into his shoulder. She felt his arms around her, and the candles flickering from the movement, and the enormous formal dining room reduced entirely to just the 2 of them, and this moment. And she felt something she had been feeling less and less of in this house over the months of Eleanor's careful erosion. She felt completely safe. He held her for a long time. And when he finally pulled back to look at her face, his own face was doing the thing she had told him not to do. It was ugly crying. Completely, without apology. He was a 42-year-old CEO of a $4.7 billion company, and he was ugly crying in his dining room. And he did not care even slightly. She touched his face with both hands. She said, "I told you not to," he said. I distinctly remember agreeing to nothing. The weeks that followed the pregnancy announcement were the weeks that Marcus Whitfield was, by any measure available, the most attentive husband that the Connecticut estate had ever housed. He called the entire household staff together the morning after the candlelit dinner. He stood before them in the main sitting room with Naomi beside him, and he was specific and warm and completely serious in the way he was always specific and warm and completely serious when he was protecting someone. His told them was the most important person in this house. He said, "She has always been the most important person in this house, and I need every single one of you to behave accordingly from this moment forward." He told them she was not to carry anything heavier than a glass of water. She was not to stand at a kitchen counter for extended periods. She was not to be allowed to overwork herself for any reason whatsoever. If she seemed tired or uncomfortable, they were to inform him immediately. If she asked for something, they were to get it before she had finished asking. He looked at each person in the room as he spoke. He held their eye long enough to make sure they understood he meant every word. And at the back of the room, in a wingback chair she had positioned near the doorway exactly as she always positioned herself, close enough to observe and far enough to maintain the performance of someone merely passing through. Eleanor Whitfield sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged into the expression of a woman feeling exactly the right emotions for this moment. Warm, proud, appropriately moved. She did not speak. She did not need to speak. The performance was not for the staff. It was for Marcus, who could see her from where he stood, who glanced at her once and saw his mother looking moved and thought, "She is trying. She is still trying." Naomi stood beside Marcus and felt his hand warm on her back, and looked at the assembled staff and thanked them quietly, and felt for a moment the specific comfort of being publicly protected by someone who meant it. She did not look at Eleanor. She had learned, over the months since the corridor, not to look at Eleanor when Marcus was in the room, because looking at Eleanor when Marcus was in the room required her to manage her own face in a way that was costly, and she was trying to be careful with what she spent. Marcus also, during these weeks, drove 40 minutes each way to a specialty grocery market on a Saturday morning in his Brioni suit because Naomi had mentioned once, in a passing conversation about the fruit she had been craving, a specific kind of mango that the estate's regular delivery service did not carry. She had mentioned it once. She had not asked for it. She had mentioned it in the way you mention things you have noticed you want, without expecting anyone to act on the noticing. He had written it down. He had found the market. He had gone. He had come home with a brown paper bag of them and set them on the kitchen counter, and said nothing about it, just left them there for her to find, which she did an hour later when she came down for water and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the mangoes and then looked at him where he was reading in the adjacent library and said, "Did you drive 40 minutes for mangoes?" And he said, without looking up from his book, "I have no idea what you are talking about." And she stood in the doorway and felt something move through her chest that she did not have a complete word for. It was not just love. It was the specific feeling of being known, of being the person whose passing comments are treated as information worth acting on, of being, for the first time in her life in any consistent and reliable way, seen. She went into the library. She sat beside him. She put her head on his shoulder. She said nothing. He turned a page. They stayed like that for a long time. Eleanor Whitfield did not congratulate Naomi on the pregnancy. Not on the day Marcus announced it to the staff. Not in the days that followed. Not in the weeks. It was not a dramatic omission. Eleanor was too sophisticated for dramatic omissions. What she did instead was continue to congratulate Marcus, warmly and repeatedly, and with the full genuine love she felt for her son, while finding reasons to be elsewhere or otherwise occupied on the specific occasions when Naomi might have reasonably expected to receive something in the way of acknowledgement. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that, if you pointed it out, could be explained away. Eleanor had been busy. Eleanor had not found the right moment. Eleanor was processing the news in her own way. And Naomi, who had spent her entire life giving people the benefit of the doubt about exactly this kind of small thing, told herself one or all of these explanations and accepted them and kept moving. But underneath the acceptance, something had shifted. The corridor conversation, the 2 months of considered erosion, and now the pregnancy announcement met with a specific pointed silence directed only at her while Marcus received warmth. The accumulation of small things was beginning to form a shape. Naomi had not named the shape yet. She was not ready to name it. But she could feel its outline. And Eleanor could see that she could feel it. And Eleanor, watching Naomi from the distance she always kept, watching those gray eyes process and adapt and continue to show up with composure and warmth, and the specific refusal to be broken that had characterized Naomi from the first moment Eleanor had encountered her, felt something sharpen inside herself. This woman was not going to be moved by small things. She had absorbed everything Eleanor had deployed so far without breaking, without going to Marcus, without giving Eleanor the dramatic confrontation that Eleanor could have used to make Naomi look difficult. She had simply continued. She had continued being warm and present and composed and exactly herself, which was precisely the problem, because exactly herself was extraordinary. And Eleanor had known from the beginning that extraordinaries was dangerous, and she had just received the confirmation that extraordinaries also had a survival instinct that was going to require something than corridor comments and rearranged flower arrangements to overcome. Eleanor made 2 phone calls on the afternoon of the day. Marcus announced the pregnancy to the staff. She waited until he was back at his desk in the study and Naomi was resting in the master bedroom as instructed. She took her phone to her private sitting room. She closed the door. She sat in her chair, and she called the first number. The first call lasted 6 minutes. The second call lasted 11. When they were done, she set the phone on the table beside her and poured herself a glass of water from the carafe on the side table and looked out the window at the manicured Connecticut grounds. The grounds were perfect. They were always perfect. She had made sure of that for 30 years. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has assessed a situation, identified the necessary response, and initiated it. Not distressed, not triumphant, simply settled. The way a person is settled when they have made a decision that they believe is both correct and necessary. She sipped her water. She waited. In the master bedroom above her, Naomi lay on the custom upholstered bed in the afternoon light, her hand resting on her stomach. The pregnancy was early, barely visible, the smallest possible beginning of something. But she could feel it. Not physically, not yet, but in the specific way that knowledge of a thing changes the quality of your relationship to your own body. She was not alone in herself anymore. She was carrying someone. She thought about what that meant. She had thought about little else since the morning on the bathroom floor. She had grown up without a mother in any functional sense. She had grown up without the specific daily experience of being someone's child, of having a person whose primary orientation to the world was shaped by the fact of you. She had built everything she had without that. She had survived everything she had survived without that, and she was proud of that, genuinely. The specific pride of someone who has made something from nothing and knows the weight of what that cost. But she had also, in the quiet private rooms of herself, where the strength did not need to perform, always known what it had cost. What it had cost her to navigate every difficult thing without a single person whose job it was to be in her corner. What it had cost her to cry alone in bathrooms and keep showing up smiling. What it had cost her to build ground that had no one else's name on it, because there was no one else to put their name on it. She was going to give her child something she had never had. She was going to be the unconditional person, the one who was always there, the one who noticed, the one who showed up without being asked and stayed without being thanked and loved without keeping score. She was going to give her child the thing that had been the one gap in an otherwise extraordinary life. And the thought of that, the specific enormous thought of that, made her press her hand harder against her stomach and close her eyes and feel something that was not quite peace but was close enough to it to carry her through the rest of the afternoon. Below her, in the private sitting room, Eleanor Whitfield finished her glass of water and set it down. The afternoon continued. The grounds were perfect. The house was quiet. And somewhere in the space between the woman resting upstairs and the woman sitting downstairs, something was already in motion that neither of them could see yet. One of them had set it in motion, and one of them had no idea it had begun. October 14th, that is the date. That is the date that everything in this story turns on. The way a door turns on a hinge, the way a life turns on a single night that arrives looking like any other night and is not. Let me take you there slowly. Because this night deserves to be entered slowly. It deserves to be felt in the specific weight of every ordinary detail before the extraordinary thing happens. Because that is how terrible things actually happen. Not dramatically, not with warning, not with any of the signals that stories usually provide to tell you that something significant is about to occur. They happen in the middle of ordinary nights, in houses that look exactly as they always look, to people who are doing exactly what they would normally be doing at that hour. They arrive without announcement. And they are all the more devastating for it. Marcus Whitfield had been in Tokyo for 2 days. The trip had been on his calendar for 6 weeks. A 36-hour meeting cycle with the Asian infrastructure partners of Whitfield Global's Sustainable Energy Division. The kind of meetings that require the CEO to be physically present and that cannot be conducted by video conference without the specific quality of attention that closes the kinds of deals as Marcus was there to close. He had left on the morning of October 12th on a private flight, and he had kissed Naomi in the entrance hall of the Connecticut estate before he left. His hand on her face for a moment longer than a goodbye, his eyes on hers with the specific quality of a man who does not like leaving the person he loves even when leaving is necessary. He had said, 2 days, I will call you when I land. She had said, go, you will be fine. He had gone. Eleanor Whitfield knew the dates of Marcus's Tokyo trip perfectly. She had known them for 6 weeks. She knew his travel schedule the way she knew his business calendar and his social calendar, and the specific rhythms of his professional life. Completely, without needing to be told. Because knowing where Marcus was at any given moment was the closest thing Eleanor had to peace of mind. She had marked the dates in the way she marked things she needed to remember. Not on paper, not on any record that could be found, but in the specific reliable storage of a mind that had been keeping precise track of important information for 64 years without ever misplacing any of it. October 12th. Marcus flies to Tokyo. October 14th. Marcus is on the other side of the world. The estate on the night of October 14th was as it always was, after 10 in the evening. Quiet in the specific way of large houses, when the staff have gone to their quarters and the rooms are too numerous and too grand to feel properly inhabited. The lights in the main rooms had been dimmed. The kitchen had been cleaned after dinner. The security system was fully operational, as it always was, its cameras covering every corridor and every entrance and every garden angle, with the comprehensive coverage of a system that had been designed by the assessed available firm, at a cost that most people would consider extraordinary. Naomi had eaten dinner alone that evening. Maria had prepared something simple and nutritious, as Marcus had instructed, and Naomi had eaten it at the kitchen island rather than the formal dining room. Because eating at the formal dining room alone felt like a performance of a life rather than the living of one. She had eaten her dinner, and she had called Marcus, who answered from his hotel in Tokyo, sounding tired but present, and they had talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. The pregnancy, a book she was reading, a detail from his meeting that he described with the specific wry humor he reserved for the absurdities of corporate diplomacy. She had laughed. He had said, go to sleep. She had said, you go to sleep. He had said, I love you. She had said, I love you too. Call me when you wake up, and she had gone upstairs. She had been sleeping lightly for weeks. The early pregnancy made rest shallow and easily interrupted, the specific quality of sleep that is never quite deep enough to feel restorative, the body too busy with what it is building to fully release into unconsciousness. She had fallen asleep sometime around 11. She had woken at some point after 2 in the morning, in the specific disorienting way of someone whose body has made a decision for them while they were under. She lay in the dark for a moment, and then she understood she was hungry. Not urgently, not desperately, but the specific low, persistent hunger of early pregnancy that is best managed by eating something small and plain before it becomes the other thing. She got up. She put on her robe, the soft cream cashmere, one that Marcus had given her at the beginning of the pregnancy, because he had noticed she was always slightly cold in the mornings. She found her socks, simple warm ones, on the chair beside the bed where she always left them. She did not turn on the main light. She did not need to. She had lived in this house long enough to know the corridor by the ambient light that came through the tall windows from the estate's exterior lighting. She moved down the hallway toward the main staircase, unhurried, slightly sleepy still, thinking about crackers. The kind she kept in the kitchen specifically for this purpose. At 2:47 a.m., according to the timestamp on the East Wing corridor camera, Naomi Whitfield turned the corner toward the kitchen, and she did not come back. Let me tell you what the cameras saw. Or rather, let me tell you what they did not see. Because the story of that night is not the story of what was captured. It is the story of what was not. The security system at the Connecticut estate covered 43 camera angles across the property. Every exterior entrance, every interior corridor, every garden perimeter. The East Wing corridor camera, the one that captured Naomi at 2:47 a.m., was functional. The image was clear. The timestamp was accurate. She walked into frame in her cream robe and her socks, and she turned the corner toward the kitchen, and she walked out of frame. That was the last image of Naomi Whitfield inside the Connecticut estate. The East Wing corridor camera covered the corridor up to the corner. It did not cover what was around the corner. The kitchen camera, which should have picked her up the moment she came around that corner, showed an empty kitchen at 2:47 a.m. and at 2:48 a.m. and at every minute thereafter until Marcus's housekeeper, Maria, came in at 7 in the morning. Naomi never reached the kitchen. Between the corner of the East Wing corridor and the kitchen, something happened that no camera in the estate was positioned to capture. The security system was comprehensive and expensive, and exactly as designed. It simply had one gap, one corridor, one section of the East Wing that connected the main house to the underground loading area used for large deliveries, an interior service passage that the external cameras covered at its exit point, but that the interior camera grid did not cover along its length. Every other corridor in the estate had coverage. This one did not. The Connecticut State Police reviewed the footage. They found what everyone found: a woman walking around a corner at 2:47 a.m. and not appearing on any subsequent camera. No vehicle leaving the property, no gate opening, no alarm, no breach. No evidence of any kind of forced exit or external intrusion. The estate was exactly as secured at 6 in the morning as it had been at 11 the night before. With one difference: Naomi was not in it. Marcus landed at JFK at 6:15 a.m. on October 15th. He had called Naomi from the plane as it was descending, because he always called her when he was close to landing, and the call had gone to voicemail. He had not been alarmed. She was probably asleep. He had left a message: "Landing now. See you in an hour. I love you. Go back to sleep." He had said it with the lightness of a man who has no reason to say it with anything other than lightness. He had collected his carry-on and come through the terminal with the specific forward energy of someone who has been away for 2 days and is moving toward home. He had called again in the car, voicemail. He had called again pulling through the estate gates, voicemail. By the time the car stopped in the motor court, his pace had changed. It was not running. It was not quite normal either. It was the specific acceleration of a body that has registered something wrong before the mind has been given permission to name it. He came through the front door calling her name. Not urgently, just calling it the way he always called it when he came home. The specific quality of a man locating the person who anchors his world. Naomi. The entrance halls gave it back to him, empty. He moved through the house, kitchen, empty. Sitting room, empty. Library, empty. Their bedroom. He stood in the doorway of the master bedroom for a moment before he went in. The bed had been slept in on her side. The sheets pushed back the way they look when someone gets up in the middle of the night, meaning to come back in 10 minutes. On the marble bedside drawer, her iPhone, face up, screen dark. On the dresser, her wallet, her perfume, her jewelry. On the hook by the bedroom door, her keys. He picked up her phone. He stood in the center of their bedroom, holding his wife's phone in his hand. He felt the floor of the world tilt beneath him in the specific way it tilts when the mind finally receives what the body has been trying to tell it for the last 40 minutes. She had not taken anything, not her phone, not her wallet, not her keys, not a coat, not shoes. Nothing that would tell you she had chosen to go anywhere. Everything that would tell you she had made a decision was still in this room. Everything that would tell you she had intended to come back was still in this room. He stood there for a moment. And then Marcus Whitfield, who was one of the most powerful men in America and who had never in his adult life felt as completely powerless as he felt in that moment, went downstairs to find out what had happened to his wife. Maria was in the kitchen when he came down. She had arrived at 7 as usual, and had gone up to Naomi's room with breakfast as Marcus had instructed, and had found the room empty, and had been sitting at the kitchen table for the last 20 minutes, not knowing what to do, because Mrs. Whitfield was always there in the mornings, and she was not there, and Maria did not know what that meant, but she knew it was wrong. Marcus walked into the kitchen, and Maria stood up. Marcus asked her, his voice quiet, controlled, the voice of a man holding everything in. "Where is my wife?" Maria's hands twisted in front of her. She said, "I do not know, Mr. Whitfield. She was not here when I came up." The bed was made on his side and pushed back on hers. Her things were all still there. "I have been waiting here trying to think what to do," Marcus said. "When did you last see her?" Maria said last night at 8. "I brought her dinner. She ate at the island. She seemed fine. She seemed happy. She was on the phone with you." Marcus said, "Has anyone else seen her since?" Maria said, "I do not know. I have not asked the others." "I did not know what to do." He nodded. He said, "Get them, all of them, in the sitting room now." He turned and walked out of the kitchen. He stood in the main sitting room with his back to the cold, framed wall, and he watched the staff file in one by one. Maria, the 2 assistant housekeepers, the estate driver, the 2 groundskeepers, the night security officer who had been on duty, and who looked like he had not slept since the question first came up. The CTV operator from the surveillance room called up from his station. They arranged themselves loosely in the room, and they looked at Marcus, and they waited. He looked at them. He was the specific kind of still that is more alarming than any movement could be. The stillness of someone using every available resource to hold themselves together in front of witnesses. His Brioni travel suit was slightly disheveled. His honey amber eyes moved across the assembled faces, one by one, holding each of them just long enough. He said, "My wife is 2 months pregnant. She has no car. She has no phone. She has no wallet. She has no keys. She is not in this house." He paused. He said, "I need someone in this room to tell me where she is." The room was silent. The driver looked at the floor. The night security officer opened his mouth and then closed it. Maria's hands twisted in front of her again. The groundskeepers exchanged a brief, frightened look and then looked back at Marcus. The 2 assistant housekeepers stood very still. The CCTV operator's hands were shaking. Nobody answered. Marcus's eyes moved across them again, slower this time. He was looking for the person whose face would tell him something. He was looking for a flinch, a glance, a shift in posture. He was looking for any indication that anyone in this room knew anything more than they were saying. He did not find it. What he found instead, when his eyes moved to the back of the sitting room near the window, was his mother. Eleanor Whitfield was seated in the wingback chair she always positioned near the window when she wanted to observe a room without being included in it. She wore a breathtaking structured Chanel suit in deep ivory and gold, the suit she had clearly put on that morning with full deliberateness, snow-white hair immaculate, red lips precisely applied, designer glasses on, short red nails folded in her lap, legs crossed at the knee with absolute precision. Her face was arranged for the morning. The expression she was wearing was a careful balance. Concern for her son, who was clearly suffering, and something cooler for the matter at hand. The concern was for him. The matter of Naomi's absence was being held at a distance. She was not looking at the staff. She was looking at Marcus. Her eyes were calm. She was the only person in the room who was not visibly frightened. Marcus's eyes stayed on her for a moment. And he registered, in the specific way he had been registering small things about his mother for years without naming them out loud, that her face was carrying concern for him and nothing at all for his wife. He saw it. He had always seen it. He was looking at it again now, in the worst possible morning of his life, and it was exactly what it had always been. He turned his back to the room. He turned slightly away from his staff and his mother, and he faced the cold, framed wall. His shoulders moved once, the specific motion of a man taking one breath that is supposed to hold him together. His hands were at his sides. His head was slightly down. He looked, in that moment, like a man about to lose his mind. The staff watched his back. Maria's hands were trembling now. The night security officer looked down at his shoes. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Eleanor watched her son's back from the wingback chair. Her expression did not change. Her short red nails remained folded in her lap. And then Marcus turned. The turn was fast. The turn was not controlled anymore. His face had changed completely in the few seconds his back had been to the room. The composure was gone. The stillness was gone. What was left was raw and unstructured and entirely on the surface of his face. His honey amber eyes were burning, his jaw was locked, his fists were clenched at his sides. He shouted,
Where is Naomi? Where is my wife?
Pregnancy hormones, darling. I am sure she will turn up.
I have always known you never liked her. Pray your hands are clean.
Where is Naomi? The shout filled the room. It came from somewhere lower in his chest than the voice he had been using a moment ago. It was not the voice of a CEO managing a situation. It was the voice of a husband whose pregnant wife was gone. Where is my wife? The staff flinched. Maria's hand went to her mouth. The driver's shoulders pulled inward. The night security officer's face went pale. The CCTV operator's eyes went wide. Eleanor's expression in the wingback chair did not change, but something behind her eyes registered. The specific microshift of a woman noting that her son was operating outside the parameters she had prepared for. The room was silent for 1 second, and then Eleanor spoke. Her voice was warm, but the warmth was directed at Marcus only. Toward him, she was the mother she had always been. Toward the matter of Naomi's absence, she was something else, something cooler, something she did not attempt to disguise. She said, Pregnancy hormones, darling. I am sure she will turn up. She said it without standing. She said it without moving toward him. She delivered the line from her seated position in the wingback chair as though she were correcting a small misunderstanding that her son in his exhaustion had blown out of proportion. Marcus turned his head toward her. Slowly, Eleanor continued, her voice still warm where it touched him, still cool where it touched the question of his wife. She said, Baby, you have been awake for almost 20 hours. You just got off a 14-hour flight. You are exhausted, and you are not thinking clearly, and you are frightening the staff. Your wife is 2 months pregnant, and these are very emotional weeks. Women in this stage do things that do not entirely make sense. They become restless. They become emotional. They sometimes need air without telling anyone they need it. Naomi has been very tired lately. You have said so yourself. She has probably gone for a walk. She has probably needed to clear her head. She is a grown woman, darling. She will come back when she is ready, and we will all feel quite silly for having worked ourselves into this state. She paused. She said, I understand you are upset. I understand the morning has been a shock. But you need to sit down and let me ring for some coffee. You need to take a breath before you say anything else in front of the staff that you will need to walk back. You are not yourself right now. Come, baby. Come sit with me. She extended one hand slightly. The short red nails. The designer rings. The hand was extended toward her son. The warmth in the gesture was for her son. Naomi's name had passed through Eleanor's mouth twice in that speech, and neither time had any of the warmth attached to it. The audience would not have been able to point at a specific word that proved. Eleanor did not care that Naomi was gone, but the absence of warmth around the name of Naomi was visible in everything Eleanor had just said. Marcus had been watching her mouth as she spoke. He had heard it. He had heard exactly what was warm and exactly what was not. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He looked at the staff who were watching this exchange with the specific terrified attention of people who understood that something was happening between mother and son, that none of them had the standing to interrupt. And then Marcus Whitfield, who had been managed his entire life by this woman, who had absorbed her performance and her motherly tone and her warm dismissals for 42 years, did something he had never done in his life. He looked at her with eyes that saw her completely. He took one step toward her. His voice was lower now, not the shout. Something more dangerous than the shout. The specific quiet that arrives in a man when he has stopped trying to be a son in front of his mother. He said, I am not going to sit down. Eleanor's hand was still slightly extended. Her face did not move. He said, I am not going to drink coffee. He took another step. He said, I am not going to calm down. Another step. He said, I am not a child you are managing through a tantrum. He was standing directly before her chair now. Eleanor was seated. He was standing. He was looking down at her. And for the first time in 42 years of mother and son, the physical dynamic of the room had reversed. He was the taller figure, the more powerful figure, the one whose voice filled the space. He said, I know, just those 2 words. Eleanor did not move, but the muscle at the corner of her mouth shifted just slightly. The kind of shift only a son who had watched that face his entire life would catch. He said, "I know you do not like her. I have known for years. I have watched you with her. I have watched what your face does when she walks into a room. I have heard the things you say to her when you think the tone of your voice will carry the meaning and the words will protect you. I have not made it a war between us because I love you and because Naomi was carrying it without asking me to fight it for her. That is not going to be the case anymore," he said. "My wife is missing. My pregnant wife is missing. She walked out of our bedroom at 2 in the morning to get a glass of water, and she did not come back. There is no version of this morning in which she chose to leave us. Somebody knows what happened to her. Somebody in this house, or somebody who had access to this house, knows." He held her eyes. He said, "I am telling you what I am telling everyone in this room. I am going to find her. I am going to use every resource I have. I am going to tear this estate down to its foundations if that is what it takes. And while I am doing that, Mother, I want you to hear me clearly. Pray your hands are clean. Pray that nothing you have ever said or done or wished out loud in a private room has any connection to what has happened to my wife. Because if it does, no relationship in this world will protect you from what I will do about it." Eleanor's face did not move, but the eyes behind the designer glasses had sharpened in the specific way a face sharpens when it is registering a new piece of information about a person it thought it already knew completely. He held her eyes for one more second. Then he turned away from her. He faced the rest of the room. The staff were frozen where they stood. Every face turned to him, every face afraid. His voice changed again. It was no longer the cold quiet he had used with Eleanor. It was something hotter, something more public. It was the voice of an employer addressing the people he employed to keep his home and his wife safe. And finding them, every one of them, insufficient. He said, "My wife is gone," he said. "She has been gone for hours and nobody in this house noticed." He said, "I employ all of you to keep this estate secure. I pay every single one of you to keep my wife safe. I am gone for 2 days, and my pregnant wife disappears from her own home and not one of you can tell me how. Not one of you can tell me where. Not one of you can tell me anything." His eyes moved across them and they landed on the CCTV operator. He said, "You sit in a room with 43 cameras, 43. And you cannot tell me what happened to my wife. What exactly is it that you have been doing for the salary I pay you?" The CCTV operator opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Marcus' eyes moved to the night security officer. He said, "You were on duty, you. The man whose job it is to protect this house in the hours my wife was taken from it. Where were you? What were you doing? What is the use of having you here at all?" The night security officer's hands shook. He did not speak. Marcus's eyes moved across the rest of them. Maria, the assistants, the driver, the groundskeepers. He spent 1 full second on each face. Long enough for each of them to feel it. Long enough for each of them to know they were being held accountable. He said, "Every single one of you failed her." The room was silent. He said, "I am going to bring my wife home. I do not know how long it will take. I do not know what it will cost. But I am going to find her. And until I do, every person who works for this estate is going to live with the knowledge that, on the one night it mattered, every one of you failed her." He looked one last time at his mother, still seated in the wingback chair. Her hands in her lap, her face unchanged. He said quietly, "Pray for her, Mother. Pray nothing has happened to her. Because if something has, I do not know what kind of man I am going to be when I find out." He held her eyes for one more beat. Then he turned and walked out of the sitting room. The sound of his footsteps on the marble floor of the entrance hall was the only sound for several seconds. The front door opened. The front door closed. He was gone. The staff stood frozen in the sitting room. Maria was crying without making any sound. The driver's hands were shaking at his sides. The night security officers was looking at the floor with the specific stunned attention of a man who had just been told his entire purpose in life had failed at the one moment it mattered. The CCTV operator looked like he was going to be sick. Eleanor sat in the wingback chair. She did not move. Her face was the same face it had been a moment ago. The Chanel suit was in place. The white hair was immaculate. The red lips were precise. The designer glasses caught the morning light from the tall windows behind her. Every external element of Eleanor Whitfield was exactly where it had been at the start of the morning. She turned her face toward the staff. Her voice when she spoke was not the warm voice she had used a moment ago with her son. It was a different voice. A voice none of the staff had heard before. Cool, clipped. Authoritative in a way that did not require warmth to enforce itself, she said from her chair. Out. The staff stared at her. She said it again, sharper this time. Each word landing like something thrown. She said, "Get out of this room now. All of you. Go back to your duties. The estate continues. Do you hear me?" The estate continues. They moved. Quickly. Maria still wiping her eyes, the driver almost stumbling. The night security officer practically running. The CCTV operator's hand against the wall as he passed through the doorway to steady himself. They moved past her toward the doorway, and they did not look at her as they passed because nobody in that room wanted to see her face in this moment. When they were gone, Eleanor remained seated in the wingback chair. She did not stand. She did not move. She looked at the empty chairs. She looked at the cold fireplace. She looked at the doorway her son had walked out of. She placed her hands more precisely in her lap. The short, red nails settled against the deep ivory and gold of the Chanel. And whatever Eleanor Whitfield was thinking in that moment, she kept entirely to herself. The room around her continued. The morning continued. The estate continued. Just as she had instructed. 3 months. That is how long Marcus Whitfield had been looking for his wife when the call finally came. 3 months that broke him in ways that men of his money and his health and his resources are not supposed to break. 3 months that took the husband who had stood in his sitting room on the morning of October 15th, and slowly, week by week, reshaped him into someone his oldest friends could not recognize. Let me show you what those months actually looked like. He started within hours. By noon on October 15th, before Connecticut State Police had even formally classified Naomi as a missing person, Marcus had already made the calls. The first call was to Aldridge Security, a private firm in Manhattan that handled investigations for the kind of clients who never appeared in newspapers. The second call was to Sentinel Group, a rival firm in Washington run by a former FBI deputy director. The third call was to a man named Ruben Castellanos in Miami, a missing persons specialist whose reputation was built on the cases nobody else could solve. By 3 in the afternoon, all 3 firms had teams in the air toward Connecticut. By 6 in the evening, Marcus had cleared out the entire east wing of the estate, the wing that contained his home office and the guest suites that nobody used. He had the housekeepers move every piece of unnecessary furniture into storage. He had the IT team install secure servers and dedicated lines and screens that filled an entire wall. He had whiteboards delivered. He had cork boards delivered. He had maps of the eastern seaboard rolled out across long folding tables. By 9 that evening, the room that had once held 2 unused guest beds and a writing desk had become something else entirely. A command center for one woman. He pinned her photographs to the cork boards in rows. The cork photograph. The candid of her laughing in the kitchen. The one Marcus had taken on their honeymoon in the south of France, her gray eyes half closed against the sun, her hair loose, her hand reaching toward the camera. The most recent one, taken 3 weeks before she disappeared, of her standing on the lawn of the estate at dusk, in a soft blue dress, smiling at something he had said off camera. 7 photographs in total. He pinned them in a line so that anyone walking into the room would see her face first, before anything else. Before the maps, before the timelines, before the questions written on the whiteboards. Her face. Always her face. That was the room he lived in for the next 3 months. The first month was velocity. He moved with the relentless forward energy of a man who believed, genuinely believed, that he was going to find her within weeks. The 3 firms divided the eastern seaboard between them and went to work. Aldridge Security took New York and New Jersey and Connecticut. Sentinel took the southern corridor from Washington to Atlanta. Castellanos took everything west of the Mississippi and the entire southern border. Marcus oversaw all of them from the East Wing War Room, reviewing reports as they came in, redirecting resources, making calls at 3 in the morning to investigators in time zones where it was a reasonable hour to work. He interviewed his own staff one by one. Maria first, then the assistant housekeepers, then the driver, then the groundskeepers, then every member of the security team, including the men who had been off duty on the night of October 14th. He sat across from each of them at the long mahogany table in his study, and he asked them the same set of questions, and he watched their faces while they answered. He was not looking for someone to break. He was looking for the small inconsistencies that would tell him whether anyone had seen anything they had not yet said out loud. He did not find anything. They were frightened. They were grieving. They were uniformly bewildered. None of them, as far as Marcus could read them, were hiding anything from him. He reviewed the CCTV footage himself, not the executive summary the police had compiled. The original footage. 43 camera angles across 14 hours. He sat in the security monitoring room with a thermos of coffee, and he watched every minute of it. He watched the East Wing corridor at 2:47 a.m. where she turned the corner. He watched it again. He watched it 20 times. He watched the kitchen camera before and after. He watched the exterior cameras for any movement, any shadow, any indication that something had happened, on the grounds that the cameras had caught but the analysts had missed. He found nothing the police had not found. He found the same gap, the same blind spot in the East Wing service corridor that no camera covered. He stood in that corridor one afternoon, alone, with the lights off, looking at the heavy service door at the far end. He stood there for nearly an hour. He walked the corridor end to end. He measured the distances with his eyes. He understood, in the cold, dim light of the unmonitored space, that this was where she had been taken. He understood that whoever had taken her had known about this corridor. He understood that knowing about this corridor required intimate familiarity with the estate's surveillance system. The kind of familiarity that only someone who had spent years inside these walls could possess. He stood there for a long time. He did not yet allow himself to follow that understanding all the way to its conclusion. The second month was harder. The leads thinned. The phone calls Marcus had been making to investigators in time zones around the country began to be returned more slowly, with smaller reports, with more frequent variations of the same essential message. "We are still working it, but we have nothing new for you yet." Marcus stopped sleeping in the master bedroom. He could not be in that room. He could not look at the side of the bed where her sheets had been pushed back at 2 in the morning. He moved into one of the smaller guest rooms in the East Wing, closer to the war room, where he could be at his desk within 2 minutes of waking up. He started sleeping in 4-hour stretches, then 3, then 2. Ruben Castellanos flew up from Miami in the second week of December and sat across from Marcus in the war room and said something Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Castellanos said, "Mr. Whitfield, I have run this kind of search 47 times in my career. I am going to tell you something that you do not want to hear, and that I am going to tell you anyway because it is my job to tell you the truth. If we have not found her by week 8, the probability that she is alive begins to drop significantly. I am still working the case. My team is still working the case. But you should begin preparing yourself for outcomes that you do not currently want to consider." Marcus looked at him across the table. Marcus said, "My wife is alive." Castellanos said, "I understand. I am simply telling you the statistics." Marcus said, "My wife is alive. I do not want to hear the statistics again." Castellanos nodded. He did not push it. He flew back to Miami the next morning and continued working the case. Because the retainer was generous, and because something in the way Marcus had said "my wife is alive" had made him wonder, for the first time in his career, whether the statistics might be wrong. By the second month, Marcus had lost 20 pounds. He was not eating. Or he was eating in the way people eat when food is fuel rather than experience, standing over the kitchen counter at midnight with whatever Maria had left for him, swallowing it without tasting it, returning immediately to the war room. His clothes hung on him differently. His Brioni suits, which had been tailored for the body of a man in his prime, now showed the slight extra space at the shoulders and the waist that comes when a body has been quietly cannibalizing itself for weeks. His hair, which had been naturally blonde with no gray in it at all on the morning he flew to Tokyo, had begun to show silver at the temples. The change happened in stages. People who saw him weekly noticed it before he did. By the end of December, he was a man with graying hair. He had not been that man 2 months earlier. His face thinned. The handsome bone structure that had always been there became irreversible as the softness around it disappeared. His honey amber eyes, which had carried warmth as a default state for his entire adult life, now carried something else. Something hollow. Something that looked at a person for one beat too long before responding, as though every conversation required him to pull himself back from somewhere distant in order to be present for it. He stopped going into the office entirely. In the second week of November, he had emailed his chief operating officer, a man named David Reinhardt, who had been at Whitfield Global for 12 years. And the email had been 4 sentences long. It had said, "David, I am unavailable until I find my wife. Do not contact me about anything that is not life-threatening to the company. You have full operational authority until further notice. Marcus." David Reinhardt had read the email twice, and then he had run the company. Calls from senators went unreturned. Calls from board members went unreturned. A scheduled appearance at the Davos Economic Forum was canceled with no explanation. A planned acquisition of a German energy company worth $2 billion was put on hold indefinitely. The corporate world processed the absence of Marcus Whitfield with the discretion that money buys us. Rumors circulated. Articles were written carefully without confirming anything, and the business of running Whitfield Global continued without him. Because David Reinhardt was an excellent operator, and because Marcus had built the company to function even when its founder could not. None of that mattered to Marcus. His wife was missing. His wife was pregnant. His wife had walked around a corner at 2:47 a.m. and disappeared from her own home. Everything else was noise. He visited shelters in person. This was the part that the investigators told him not to do. Castellanos in particular had asked him, with the patience of a man who had seen too many wealthy clients try to do the investigative work themselves, to please stay in the war room and let the professionals do the searching. But Marcus could not stay in the war room. He needed motion. He needed to be in the places where she might be. He needed his own eyes on the rooms where pregnant women without identification might be sleeping. He went to a women's shelter in the Bronx at 3 a.m. in late November. He drove himself. He wore jeans and a wool coat and a baseball cap because he had finally accepted that arriving in a Brioni suit would frighten the women he needed to talk to. He sat at a folding table in the shelter's intake room with a printed photograph of Naomi in his hand. He showed it to the night staff. He showed it to the women who were still awake. He showed it to a woman in her 60s who had been sleeping at this shelter on and off for 15 years, and who looked at the photograph for a long time before she shook her head and said, "I would remember those eyes." "I have not seen those eyes," Marcus thanked her. He bought coffee for the night staff. He left a substantial check with the shelter's director and asked her to call him if anyone matching the description ever came through her doors. He drove to another shelter that night, and another the night after, and another. He visited 11 shelters in 3 weeks. He showed the photograph to over 200 people. He learned the geography of homelessness in the eastern United States with the same precision he had once learned the geography of corporate finance. He found nothing. Every shelter director gave him the same answer. "I would tell you if I had seen her. I would remember." He drove home each time in the dark. He sat in his car in the motor court of the estate for long minutes before he went inside. He did not want to go inside. The house was unbearable. The house was where she was supposed to be. There was one afternoon, in the middle of the second month, when he allowed himself to do something he had been avoiding. He went into the master bedroom. He had not been in it in weeks. He had been sleeping in the East Wing guest room. He had been sending Maria in to retrieve anything he needed from the master closet. But on this afternoon, for reasons he could not have explained to anyone including himself, he walked into the master bedroom, and he stood in the center of it, and he looked at the room exactly as it had been on the morning of October 15th. Her things were still where she had left them. He had refused to let anyone move them. The wallet on the dresser, the perfume bottles in their precise arrangement, the jewelry tray, her keys on the hook. The book she had been reading was still on the bedside table, marked at the page she had stopped at. The cream cashmere's robe she had been wearing, the last time she stood up from this bed, was over the chair where she had left it before she walked downstairs. He stood in the middle of the room. He walked to the bedside table. He picked up her book. He opened it to the marked page. He read the paragraph she had stopped at. He read it twice. He read it a third time. He held the book to his face, and he breathed in the faint trace of her perfume that still clung to the pages. He picked up the cream robe from the chair. He sat down on the bed, on her side, where the sheets had been pushed back the morning he came home. He held the robe in both hands. He pressed it to his face. And the man who was one of the most powerful figures in American industry, The man who had stood in his sitting room and warned his mother in front of witnesses. The man who had not let himself fully cry in nearly 2 months, sat on the edge of his wife's side of the bed and cried into her robe like a child. He cried for a long time. When he finally stopped, he stood up. He carefully placed the robe back on the chair exactly as she had left it. He left the book on the bedside table. He closed the door behind him quietly, and he went back to the war room. He found other things over those weeks. A note in her handwriting, in a kitchen drawer. Just a small thing. A reminder to herself to call her dentist, written in her neat, precise handwriting. He held it for an hour. A mango in the bottom of the fruit bowl, the last one he had bought her, slightly bruised now, that nobody had thrown out because nobody knew it had a story attached to it. He held the mango in his hand and laughed once, the broken sound of a man laughing at something that was not funny anymore, and then he put it carefully into a plastic bag and into the freezer, because he could not bear to throw it away. The wrapped pregnancy test she had given him at the candlelit dinner. He had kept it in the top drawer of his bedside table. He took it out one night and he held it. The handwriting on the small card was still legible. "You are going to be someone's father. Try not to ugly cry." He read it. He could not read it again. These small objects became the architecture of his grief during those weeks. The wallet, the robe, the book, the note, the mango, the card. Each one a piece of her that the house had retained. A small evidence that she had been here, that she had been real, that she had not been a thing he had imagined. He carried the card in his wallet from that night on. And while Marcus was unraveling, in slow stages, in the east wing of the estate, his mother carried the disappearance in her own way. Eleanor Whitfield grieved publicly. She wore midnight black to the private prayer service Marcus organized in the second month, a small, intimate gathering of family friends and clergy at the estate's chapel. She sat in the front row in a Chanel suit with a small matching hat and a delicate veil, and she wept quietly through the prayers, dabbing at her eyes with a fine linen handkerchief. She accepted condolences from a sitting cabinet secretary on the phone. Her voice catching at the moment a daughter-in-law's absence was acknowledged out loud. She received flowers from 3 former first ladies. She wrote handwritten thank you notes to each of them on her personal stationery. Her white hair immaculate at her writing desk, the short red nails moving precisely down the page. Anyone watching her during those months would have said the same thing about her. That Eleanor Whitfield was a woman undone by what had happened to her son's wife. That the white hair seemed a little whiter. That the precise red lipstick was sometimes slightly less precise than it had been before. That she had aged, the way Marcus had aged, the way the whole house had aged in the weeks since October. Whether what she was carrying was the same thing her son was carrying, or whether it was something else, only Eleanor knew. And Eleanor was not the sort of woman who gave that information away. She kept her distance from Marcus during those months. Whatever she had felt in the sitting room on the morning of October 15th, whatever Marcus had said to her in front of the staff, she did not attempt to revisit it. She did not push for closeness. She did not ask him for forgiveness, because asking for forgiveness when none had been formally withheld would have been to acknowledge a fight she preferred to pretend had not happened. She simply gave him room, the room he clearly needed. The room any mother might give a son whose wife was missing. She was present when he needed her. She was absent when he did not. She moved through the estate quietly, in beautiful suits that nobody saw her wear, with her hair done and her face done, and the full daily appearance of Eleanor Whitfield deployed for an audience of household staff and herself. They saw each other rarely. When they did, it was in passing, in the entrance hall or along one of the corridors, brief encounters where she would ask, with the appropriate gentleness, whether there had been any news. He would say no. He would not look at her when he said it. He would continue past her, into whatever room he had been heading to. She would watch his back as he moved away from her, and then she would continue with whatever she had been doing, her face composed, her short red nails at her sides, her white hair immaculate, her red lips precisely applied even on a Tuesday morning when nobody was watching, except, perhaps, a housekeeper, who had long since learned not to look directly at Mrs. Whitfield the elder when she came through a room. Eleanor spent her evenings in her sitting room alone. She read, as she had always read, history mostly, biographies of women who had lived long public lives, the kind of books she had filled her shelves with for 40 years. She drank a small glass of sherry before bed, as she had drunk a small glass of sherry before for 40 years. She did not change her routines. Whatever she was thinking about during those long evenings, in the firelight of her private sitting room, she did not share with anyone. She had not been the sort of woman to share what she was thinking, even when life was simpler, and life was not simpler now. She waited, as the household waited, for whatever was going to come next. By January, 3 months from the morning Naomi had disappeared, Marcus had still found nothing. The investigators were still on the case. The retainers were still being paid. The leads were still being followed, but the leads themselves had thinned to the point of being almost non-existent. There were no new sightings. There were no new theories. There was no new ground to cover that had not already been covered 3 times. Marcus had lost 30 pounds. He had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in over a month. The gray at his temples had spread further into his hair. His face was the face of a man who had been at war for 3 months and was losing. One night in early January, for the first time since the morning he came home from Tokyo, Marcus went into the master bedroom to sleep. He could not have told you why that night. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was that the small guest room had become its own kind of prison. Maybe it was that some part of him needed, after 3 months, to be in the room where she had last been, to sleep where she had slept, to stop running from the one room in the house that still held the most of her. He showered. He put on the clothes he slept in. And then, instead of getting under the covers, he sat down on the edge of the bed, on his own side, and he looked at her side. The sheets were still pushed back the way they had been the morning he came home. He had never let anyone fix them. Her robe was still over the chair. Her book was still on the bedside table. Her perfume still sat in its precise row on the dresser. The room was a museum of the last ordinary night of his life, and he sat on the edge of it in the dark, and he let himself remember her. He thought about the way she laughed. He thought about the candlelit dinner and the small box beside his plate. He thought about driving 40 minutes for the mangoes and pretending he had no idea what she was talking about. He thought about the way she had cried in the bathroom in private when she thought he could not hear her, and how he had heard her, and how he had never said anything because he had not known what to say, and how he would give every dollar he had to hear that sound again now, because at least it would mean she was somewhere in the world making it. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and he allowed himself, for the first time in 3 months, to consider the possibility that he was not going to find her. Not because he believed it. He still did not believe it, but because the weight of 3 months, without a single lead, had begun to press on him in a way that required him to at least look at the possibility. The way a man dying of thirst eventually looks at the salt water, knowing it will kill him, but unable to stop himself from looking. He looked at her side of the bed. He said quietly, to the empty room, to no one, to her, "I am still here. I am still looking. Do not give up on me yet." The room did not answer, and then his phone rang. It was Ruben Castellanos. It was 2:47 a.m. Castellanos' voice, when Marcus answered, was different than it had been in any of their previous calls. It was careful. It was measured. It was the voice of a man who had bad news to deliver and was choosing his words with the precision required to deliver it. Castellanos said, "Mr. Whitfield, I need you to come to a location in northern New Jersey as soon as you can get here. A body has been found." Marcus did not speak. He sat on the edge of his wife's bed with the phone pressed to his ear, and he did not move, and he did not breathe. Castellanos said, "I am sorry, I am not yet able to confirm the identification, but the description matches. I need you to come. I need you to come now." Marcus stood up from the edge of the bed. He picked up his keys. He walked out of the master bedroom into the dark state, and he did not say a word, and he did not call his mother, and he did not call anyone. And he drove himself to northern New Jersey in his own car, in the dark, with the radio off, the longest drive of his life. The drive he had been imagining and refusing to imagine for 3 straight months. He did not know yet what he was going to find when he got there. But he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had been hollowed out by 3 months of waiting, that whatever he found would change everything. The drive from Connecticut to northern New Jersey takes about 3 hours in the dark before dawn. For Marcus Whitfield, it was the longest 3 hours of his life. He drove himself. He had not woken his driver. He had not called his security detail. He had not called anyone, because calling someone would have meant saying the words out loud, and as long as he did not say the words out loud, there was still a version of the night in which they were not true. So he drove alone, through the dark, down empty highways, with the radio off and the heater running, and his hands locked on the wheel at 10 and 2 like a man, holding on to the only solid thing left in the world. He did not let himself think about what he was driving toward. He tried to think about anything else. He thought about the first time he saw her at the charity gala. The way the whole room had seemed to reorganize itself around her without her doing anything to make it happen. He thought about the way she said his name. He thought about the mango on the kitchen counter, and the candlelit dinner, and the small card in his wallet that he could feel against his chest through the leather. He thought about everything except the cold room at the end of the drive and the table in the cold room, and the thing on the table that Castellanos had been so careful not to describe. But the mind does not obey in moments like that. And somewhere around the second hour, on a dark stretch of highway with no other cars in sight, the thought he had been holding off finally arrived, and it arrived complete. What if it is her? What if the next hour is the hour I find out she is dead? What if I have to call her by name in a cold room and identify her body, and then drive home and live the rest of my life in a world that does not have her in it? He pulled over onto the shoulder. He sat in the dark with the engine running, and he put his head against the steering wheel, and he breathed. In, out, in, out. He did not let himself cry, because if he started, he was not going to be able to drive. And he had to drive, because she needed him to get there, whatever there turned out to be. After a few minutes, he straightened up. He put the car back in gear. He pulled back onto the highway. And he drove the rest of the way with the thought sitting beside him in the passenger seat, like a passenger he could not put out of the car. He arrived at the medical examiner's office a little after 5 in the morning. Castellanos was waiting for him in the parking lot. So was a detective from the New Jersey State's Police, a heavy-set man in a rumpled coat who introduced himself quietly and shook Marcus's hand with the gentleness of a man who did this often and hated it every time. They walked him inside. The building was institutional and overlit and smelled of cold and antiseptic. They led him down a corridor to a small waiting area, and a woman came out to meet them. The medical examiner, in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back, and kind, tired eyes that had seen too much, and had never managed to grow a callus over any of it. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, I am so sorry you are here. I want to walk you through what's going to happen before we go in." She explained it gently. She explained that the woman they had found had been in the woods for some time. She explained that a visual identification of the face would not be straightforward, and that they would be relying on height, build, hair, and any identifying features Marcus could recognize. She explained that he should take whatever time he needed, and that if at any point he could not continue, that was completely understandable. Marcus listened. He nodded. His face had gone very still. She asked, "Are you ready?" He said yes. He was not. Nobody ever is. But he said yes because the only thing worse than walking into that room was standing outside it not knowing. They took him into a cold room. The light was hard and white. There was a table in the center of the room and a shape on the table under a pale sheet. The medical examiner positioned herself at the head of the table. Castellanos stood near the door. The detective hung back. And Marcus walked to the side of the table, and he looked down at the sheet, and he made himself breathe. The examiner said, "Take your time." Marcus said, "Do it." She drew the sheet back to the shoulders, and Marcus Whitfield looked down at a young woman with dark hair, who was approximately his wife's height and approximately his wife's build, and was not his wife. It was not her. The young woman on the table was a stranger. She had a different shape to her face, a different line to her brow. Whoever she was, whatever had happened to her, she was not Naomi. It was not her. The relief hit him so hard and so fast that his knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the table to stay upright. A sound came out of him that was not quite a word and not quite a sob, the sound of Maz, who has been holding his breath for 3 months and has finally been allowed to let it out. His eyes flooded. His whole body shook with it. Castellanos stepped forward and put a hand on his shoulder to steady him, and Marcus stood there gripping the cold steel table and shaking and letting the relief move through him in waves because there was nothing else he could do. She was not dead. She was still out there. She was still alive, The search was still alive. And then, half a second behind the relief, came the thing that told you everything about the kind of man Marcus Whitfield was. He looked down at the stranger on the table, and the relief turned, immediately, into shame. Because this young woman was somebody. She was somebody's daughter. She was somebody's missing person. Somewhere in the world, there was a family that did not yet know what Marcus now knew, a mother or a father or a sister who was still searching, still hoping, still living in the not knowing that Marcus had been living in for 3 months and had just, this minute, been released from. He had walked into this room praying that the woman on the table would be a stranger. His prayer had been answered. And the answer to his prayer was someone else's catastrophe. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked at the medical examiner, and he asked her a question that she would remember for the rest of her career. He said, "Who is she?" The examiner said, "We do not know yet. She has not been identified. There is no match in the missing persons database so far." Marcus said, "What would it take to identify her?" The examiner explained, "Forensic work, dental records, DNA, the kind of testing that takes time and resources, and that, for an unidentified woman with no immediate family pushing for answers, often sits at the bottom of an overworked county's list for months, sometimes years, sometimes forever." Marcus said, "I will pay for it, all of it, whatever it costs. I want her identified. I want her name back. I want her family found. Whatever your office needs, send the bill to me." The room went quiet. The medical examiner looked at this man, this stranger, who had walked in 20 minutes ago braced to identify his own wife's body, who had just been spared the worst thing a person can be asked to face, and who was now standing in her cold room with tears still wet on his face, offering to pay to bring a stranger's daughter home. In 20 years, she had never seen anything like it. She said, "That is very generous, Mr. Whitfield." Marcus said, "Somebody should be looking for her. The way I am looking for my wife." He kept his word. Quietly, anonymously, with no acknowledgement and no credit, and no one outside that room ever knowing, Marcus paid for the full forensic identification of the young woman found in the woods of northern New Jersey. It took 6 weeks. Her name was returned to her. She was a 24-year-old woman from Ohio who had been missing for over a year. Her family was located. Her body was returned to them. They held a funeral. They were finally able to stop searching and start grieving, which is its own terrible mercy. They never knew who had paid for it. They never knew that the money that brought their daughter home had come from a man in Connecticut who was, at that very moment, still searching for his own missing wife. That was Marcus Whitfield. That is who he was, even standing at the lowest point of his entire life. He drove back to Connecticut as the sun came up. And somewhere on that drive, the relief that had nearly knocked him to the floor began to change into something harder and more useful. It began to change into resolve, because the body in New Jersey had taught him something he had not known until he stood over it. It had taught him exactly what it would feel like to find Naomi dead. He had stood at the edge of that and looked all the way down into it, and he had been pulled back from the edge at the last second, and now that he had felt the full weight of what losing her would actually mean, he understood something with a clarity he had not had the day before. He was not going to stop, not at 3 months, not at 6, not at a year, not ever. He was going to find his wife if it took the rest of his life, and every dollar he had, and every resource on earth. And the certainty of that settled into him on that sunrise drive and did not leave. He called his investigators from the car. He told them to expand the search, double the teams, triple them. He told them money was no longer a consideration of any kind, that there was no budget, that there was no limit, that they were to chase every lead no matter how small, or how expensive, or how unlikely. He told Castellanos he wanted. The search widened beyond the eastern seaboard. He wanted hospitals checked. He wanted clinics checked. He wanted every place a woman without identification might pass through, no matter how briefly, examined and re-examined. He drove home into the sunrise with his jaw set and his hands steady on the wheel, more certain than he had been in 3 months that Naomi was alive somewhere and that he was going to find her. He did not yet know how right he was. What Marcus did not know, as he drove home that morning, hardening into resolve, was where his mother had been the night the call came. While Marcus was in a cold room in New Jersey, preparing to identify what might have been his wife, Eleanor Whitfield had been 300 miles away in Washington, At a blacktop gala in a historic hotel ballroom, in a floor-length Oscar de la Renta gown, the color of deep wine, her white hair swept up, her diamonds catching the light, a glass of champagne held loosely in one red-nailed hand. It was a charity event for a foundation she had supported for 30 years. Senators were there. Ambassadors were there. A former president was there. Eleanor moved through the room the way she had moved through such rooms her entire life, gracious and luminous, and entirely in command of the space around her. When word reached her, sometime after midnight, through a discreet phone call from a member of the household staff, that a body had been found and that Marcus had gone to identify it, Eleanor stepped out of the ballroom into a quiet corridor to take the call. She listened. She asked whether Marcus had someone with him. She was told he had Castellanos. She said she would wait to hear, and then she ended the call and stood alone in the corridor for a moment, and then she returned to the gala. She did not leave. She did not call her son. She finished the evening. She said her goodbyes near 1 a.m. She thanked the host. She complimented the orchestra, and she rode back to her Washington residence in the back of a town car. Her face turned toward the window, watching the monuments slide past in the dark, her expression giving away nothing at all to the driver who occasionally glanced at her in the mirror. Some who heard about it afterward found it strange that a mother would stay at a party while her son drove through the night to identify a body that might have been his wife. Others said grief and fear show themselves differently in different people, and that Eleanor Whitfield had never in her life been a woman who let anything move her in public. What was actually happening behind that composed face, only Eleanor knew. She offered no explanation to anyone. She never did. The next morning, when Marcus called the household to say the body had not been Naomi, the staff wept with relief. Eleanor, in Washington, received the news by phone. She thanked the caller. She set the phone down on the marble surface of her residence's entryway table, and then she went to have her breakfast, exactly as she did every morning, the white hair immaculate, the red lips already in place, the routines of a lifetime entirely undisturbed. The second stretch of the search began. After New Jersey, Marcus searched for 3 more months. January became February. February became March. The teams expanded as he had ordered. The search widened beyond the eastern seaboard. Investigators checked hospitals across a dozen states. They checked clinics. They checked any institution where a woman without a name might have surfaced, however briefly. They followed leads to Pittsburgh and Baltimore and Richmond and a dozen smaller places, and each lead rose and crested and broke against the same shore as all the others. Nothing. Marcus did not break this time. The resolve that had hardened in him on the drive home from New Jersey held. He still did not sleep much. He still ate without tasting. But the wild, desperate velocity of the first 3 months had been replaced by something steadier and more durable. The patience of a man who has decided he is going to do this for as long as it takes and has stopped measuring his hope by the day. He kept the card in his wallet. He kept her things exactly as she had left them. He kept the war room running. And every morning he got up and he did it again. Because she was alive, he knew she was alive. And somewhere out there she was waiting for him to find her even if she did not know it. By April, 6 months from the night she had disappeared, the search had covered enormous ground and found nothing definitive. There were no new sightings, no new theories. The leads that had once come in weekly had slowed to almost nothing. Marcus did not stop. He had promised himself he never would. But the machine he had built was running on fumes, and he knew it. And then, in the second week of April, something pulled him out of the estate for the first time in months. Not a lead, not the search. Business. James Alderman had been Marcus's friend for over 20 years. They had come together, 2 young men in an industry that chewed up most of the people who entered it. And they had stayed close through every version of themselves since. James now ran Alderman Tech, a company headquartered in Philadelphia, and for the better part of a year, Whitfield Global and Alderman Tech had been working toward a major partnership, the kind of deal that gets carried by lieutenants right up until the final table, where it needs the principals themselves to close it. David Reinhardt had taken it as far as he could. The last meeting needed Marcus. James called him personally. He talked about the deal, because he knew Marcus would say yes to the deal. But that was not the only reason he was calling, and both men knew it. James had watched his friend disappear into grief for 6 months. He had watched a man he loved hollow himself out, searching for a wife the whole world had quietly started to believe was never coming back. And James, in the careful way of an old friend who knows better than to say the thing directly, was using the deal as a reason to put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and pull him, just for one day, back into the land of the living. Marcus almost said no. He stood in the war room with the phone to his ear, and he looked at the wall of his wife's face, and he almost told James to send the papers and let Reinhardt handle it. Leaving the estate felt like abandoning her. Leaving felt like giving up, even for a day. But James was his friend. The deal was real. And some quiet part of Marcus, the part that had not spoken in months, understood that he could not live inside that war room forever. That at some point he had to put one foot back into the world, or the world would close over the place where he used to be. So he said yes, one meeting, one day, Philadelphia. He had his suit pressed for the first time in months. He had the car brought around. And on a bright Tuesday morning in April, Marcus Whitfield rode to Philadelphia to close a business deal with an old friend, carrying his wife's handwritten card in his wallet, the way he carried it everywhere now. He had no idea. He had no idea that the most ordinary obligation of his old life, a business meeting, a handshake, a favor for a friend, was about to walk him straight into the one thing that 6 months and 3 investigation firms and every dollar he had been willing to spend had completely failed to find. He thought he was going to Philadelphia to sign a deal. The Alderman Tech Building rose 26 stories of glass and steel over the center of Philadelphia, catching the bright April morning light along every edge. Marcus had been to this building before, years ago, back when he was the version of himself that went to buildings like this without thinking twice about it. The version that closed deals and shook hands and moved through the corporate world as though it had been built for him. Because in many ways, it had. He stepped out of the car onto the curb in his pressed navy Brioni suit, and for a moment he simply stood there and looked up at the height of it, and he felt the strangeness of being back in a world he had walked away from 6 months ago without a backward glance. He did not belong to this world anymore. He knew that. He had become someone else in the war room of that estate, someone thinner and grayer and emptier, and the suit he was wearing felt less like his own skins than it once had, and more like a costume from an old life he was borrowing for the day. But he straightened his jacket. He squared his shoulders, and he walked in. James Alderman met him in the lobby, personally. That was James. He could have sent an assistant. He could have had Marcus shown up to the executive floor. Instead, he came down himself. And when he saw Marcus crossing the marble lobby toward him, something moved across his face. The quiet shock of a man seeing how much his friend had changed, quickly covered by warmth. The two men embraced. James held the embrace a beat longer than a business greeting required. One hand firm on Marcus's back, the silent language of an old friend's sayings. I have got you. You are here. You made it out of the house. When they pulled apart, James looked at him and said, It is good to see you, brother. It has been too long, Marcus said. It has. Thank you for this. I needed the push, James said. I know. Come on. They are setting up upstairs. We will get through this, and then I am buying you the best lunch in Philadelphia, whether you want it or not. And Marcus, for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt something that was almost like normalcy, the feeling of being a man among men he trusted, doing the ordinary work of his ordinary life. It was small, but after 6 months of darkness, it felt like stepping into a patch of sun. They crossed the lobby together. James talked about the deal, about the partnership, about the people waiting upstairs, the easy, fluent shorthand of 2 executives who had done this kind of thing 100 times. Marcus listened and nodded and answered. And the part of him that had been a CEO, his entire adult life, woke up and remembered how to do this. And for a few minutes, walking through that bright glass building beside his oldest friend, Marcus Whitfield was almost himself again. They reached the elevators. James was still talking. Marcus was half listening, his eyes drifting idly across the ground floor the way you look at a place you are passing through, not really seeing it. And then they turned the corner toward the executive elevators. And Marcus stopped walking. There was a woman down the corridor. She was perhaps 40 feet away, near the far wall, and she had her back half turned to him. She was wearing the gray and white uniform of the building's cleaning staff. She was working a mop slowly across the polished floor, her movements careful and a little heavy, the movements of a woman who was very pregnant and on her feet anyway. A cleaning cart stood beside her. A yellow sign warned of a wet floor. Marcus looked at her. And the world stopped. Because even from 40 feet, even from behind, even in a gray uniform he had never seen and could never have imagined, there was something about the set of her shoulders, the line of her neck, the particular way she tilted her head as she worked. Something his body recognized before his mind would let him believe it. He had spent 6 months seeing her everywhere, in crowds, in passing cars, in the faces of strangers at shelters. His grief had conjured her 100 times, and 100 times it had been a cruel trick of a desperate mind. He had learned not to trust it. He had learned that the woman across the room was never her. That hope was a knife, that he could not survive being wrong one more time. So he stood frozen at the corner, and he told himself, the way he had told himself 100 times, it is not her. It is not her. It is never her. And then the woman straightened up. She put one hand to the small of her back, the unconscious gesture of a pregnant woman easing an ache. She turned her head, glancing toward the windows, and Marcus saw her face. He saw the warm brown skin. He saw the line of her jaw. And he saw, even from across that corridor, even after 6 months, the one thing in the entire world that could not be faked or imagined or conjured by grief. He saw her eyes. Those extraordinary light gray eyes. It was Naomi. The sound that came out of him was not a word. James turned, startled, following Marcus's gaze down the corridor, not understanding. Marcus had gone completely white. His hand had come up to his own chest. He was staring down the corridor with an expression James had never seen on a human face. Something between agony and rapture, the look of a man witnessing the impossible. Marcus took a step forward, then another, and then he was walking fast down the corridor. His polished shoes loud on the floor, his whole body pulled forward toward her by 6 months of searching, 6 months of grief, 6 months of refusing to stop, all of it collapsing into this one impossible moment. And the relief broke over him so enormous and so total that he could barely breathe around it. She was alive. She was alive. After everything. After the body in New Jersey. After the shelters and the dead leads and the nights he had sat on the edge of their bed talking to an empty room. After the whole world had quietly decided she was gone. She was alive, and she was here 40 feet away, and in a moment he was going to hold her, and the nightmare was going to be over. He said her name. His voice cracked on it. He said Naomi. The pregnant woman in the cleaning uniform looked up. She heard a man's voice say a name. She did not know the name. The name meant nothing to her. But the voice was raw and breaking and very close now. And she looked up from her work to see a tall man in an expensive suit walking quickly toward her, his face wet, his eyes enormous, his arms beginning to rise, as though he meant to reach for her. And every instinct in her body went cold with alarm. Because she did not know this man. She had never seen him before in her life, as far as she knew, and what she knew was very little. Only the small, careful world she had been living in, for as long as she could remember, which was not very long at all. She knew the apartment. She knew the kind people who had taken her in. She knew the bus route and the building she cleaned, and the weight of the child she was carrying. That was the size of her world. It did not contain this man. It did not contain the way he was looking at her, like she was something he had lost, like she belonged to him. She stepped back. Her hand tightened on the mop handle, holding it across her body, a small, instinctive barrier between herself and the stranger rushing toward her. And yet, for 1/2 of 1 second, when she looked at his face, something moved in her. It was not a memory. It was less than a memory. It was a flicker, a flash of something, with no shape and no name. A feeling that arrived and vanished too fast to hold. Like a word on the tip of the tongue that dissolves the instant you reach for it. Something about his eyes. Something warm and golden and familiar in a way that made no sense, that frightened her more than it comforted her, because she did not understand it. Because her mind reached for it and found nothing there, only a closed door with no light underneath it. The flicker passed, and it left only fear. She backed away another step. She looked at this weeping stranger with wide, alarmed eyes, this powerful man who knew her name when she did not know his. And she did the only thing a frightened person can do when a stranger reaches for them as though they have every right to. She told him the truth, the terrible, impossible truth. In a voice that was quiet and shaking and absolutely certain, she said, "I'm sorry, I don't know you." Marcus stopped, 3 feet away from her, close enough to touch, close enough to see every detail of the face he had been looking for across half a country for 6 months. Close enough to see that the gray eyes looking back at him held no recognition at all. None. Not a flicker that lasted. Not a trace of the woman who had laughed into his shoulder in a candlelit dining room. Not the faintest shadow of the wife who had said his name 10,000 times. She was looking at him the way you look at a stranger. She was looking at him the way you look at someone you have never met. His arms were still half raised. His face was still wet. The relief that had been breaking over him a moment ago hung in the air, suddenly with nowhere to go. Suddenly transforming into something his mind could not process, because his wife was standing in front of him. Alive, pregnant with his child. And she had just looked into his eyes and told him she did not know who he was. He whispered it. He could barely make the sound. He said, "Naomi, it is me, it is Marcus." And she took another step back, her hand protective over the curve of her belly, her gray eyes filling with the fear of a cornered woman, and she said it again, and this time her voice broke on it. She said, "I don't know you, please, I don't know who you are." 200 miles away in the Connecticut estate, the phone on Eleanor Whitfield's private line rang in her sitting room. Not the household line, not the family line, the private line, the one whose number was given only to a very small number of people. She was at her writing desk. She set down her pen. She lifted the receiver the way she answered everything, with composure, with the unhurried calm of a woman who had not been surprised by a telephone in 40 years. She did not say hello. She listened, and something in her face changed. It was small. If you had been in the room, you might have missed it. The very slight stillness that came over her, the way her hand, the one with the short red nails, went flat against the surface of the desk and pressed down, as though steadying herself against something. The way her eyes, behind the designer glasses, fixed on the middle distance and stopped moving. Naomi had been found. Naomi was alive. In Philadelphia, Marcus had found her. The news was already moving through the household, through the family, through the channels that carried such things. Eleanor sat very still at her desk and listened to the voice on the phone, and whatever moved through her in that moment, she did not let it reach her voice. When she finally spoke, she said the right things, the things a mother-in-law would say. "Oh, thank God. Where? Is she all right? Is the baby all right?" But her free hand stayed pressed flat against the desk the entire time, and after she ended the call, she did not move for a long moment. She sat alone in her sitting room, and the composure that never failed her seemed, for the length of a single held breath, to require effort. Whether what crossed Eleanor Whitfield's face in that quiet room was the unease of a guilty woman whose carefully buried problem had just resurfaced alive, or the ordinary shock of a grandmother receiving impossible news, the audience could not be certain. But the red nails stayed pressed against the desk, and Eleanor Whitfield, for the first time in a very long time, looked like a woman who had just been told something she was not prepared to hear. Back in Philadelphia, in a bright corridor on the ground floor of the Alderman Tech Building, two people stood 3 feet apart. One of them had searched for 6 months and crossed half a country and refused to give up when the entire world told him to. One of them had no idea who he was. Marcus Whitfield stood frozen in his Brioni suit with tears running freely down his face, looking at his missing wife, alive, pregnant, found at last, after everything. And Naomi Carter looked back at the weeping stranger with frightened gray eyes, holding a mop across her body like a shield, protecting the child inside her from a man she did not remember loving. She said it one more time, barely a whisper, "I don't know you." And there, in a bright corridor of an ordinary glass building in Philadelphia, on an ordinary Tuesday in April, the search for Naomi Whitfield ended. And a new question began, because she was alive after 6 months. After everyone but her husband had quietly decided she was gone. She was alive, and she was standing right in front of him, 8 months pregnant with the child they had made together. And she did not know him. She did not know herself. She did not know how she had ended up in that uniform in that building cleaning floors for strangers, while a billionaire searched the country for her. And in a quiet sitting room 200 miles away, a woman with snow-white hair and red nails sat at her writing desk, her hand pressed flat against the wood, and listened to a voice on a private line tell her something she had not been prepared to hear. That is where we leave part 1. In part 2, we are going to answer every question this story has placed in front of you. Where Naomi has been for 6 months, who took her in when she had nothing, what happened to her memory, and whether it is ever coming back. The truth, the full truth, of what happened on the night of October 14th, told by a witness who has been carrying it in silence and is finally going to speak. The collision that has been building since the first moment of this story, and whether justice can reach someone who has spent 50 years making sure it never could. If you have made it this far, you already know this story is not over, not even close. Part 2 is where everything you have suspected, and a few things you have not, gets answered. If you want to know how this ends, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you do not miss the second half. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think happened to her, who you think is responsible, what you think Naomi will remember and what she never will. I will see you in part 2.